I died at my desk. Not heroically. No last words, no weeping family, no swelling music. I died face down on a keyboard at 3 in the morning after 14 straight days of overtime, and the last thing I ever felt in that life was my own drool cooling on the spacebar. Cause of death per the universe, quarterly targets. My manager sent flowers to the funeral and, I am almost certain, expensed them. And here's the part that still gets me. As my soul peeled up out of that ergonomic chair I never once got to enjoy, I had exactly one thought, and the thought was, finally, rest. Sweet, dreamless, unpaid invoice-free rest. The universe heard that thought. And the universe said, in a voice like a slot machine warming up, LOL. No. We are just getting started, friend. Because I did not go to heaven. I went to a baby, a newborn in a different world entirely. A world with sword-immortals and cultivation and monsters and rivers of ki, the whole mystical starter pack. And let me tell you, there is nothing quite like being a grown adult with a full memory of dying at your desk, trapped inside a body that cannot hold up its own head. I spent my first year in that world as the most articulate, most furious, most completely helpless infant in history, lying there thinking detailed thoughts about spreadsheets while people made cooing noises and wiped my face. If there is a more humbling way to start over, I have not found it, and I have started over 10 times. And welded into my soul like the most aggressive loyalty program ever devised was a small, glowing panel that only I could see. A system. The rules were simple, the way a bear trap is simple. 10 lives, each one exactly 100 years, not a day longer. Survive a full year without dying, and the system paid out. A technique, a treasure, a bloodline. Something that would make an ordinary cultivator weep into his sleeve. Reach 100. And you reincarnate. Fresh baby, fresh century, cultivation reset all the way back to squishy, useless 0. But you kept the memories. Every single one. 900 years stacked in my skull like the longest, strangest resume ever written. 9 times I had done this. 9 lives, 9 deaths, 900 birthdays of being handed a god-tier cheat code and then having it all clawed back to 0 at the finish line, like a casino that only ever pays out in Mondays. This was life number 10. The last one. And this time the system had added a line I had never seen in 900 years. Prove your Tao before you die and you ascend. Become an actual immortal. Step off the ride forever. Fail. And well, it didn't say. It just left the sentence hanging there. The way every company I ever worked for left, will be in touch, hanging there. And by my second lifetime I understood exactly what that particular silence means. So, no pressure. Just 1,000 years of build-up riding on one final run. Now, when this story actually starts, I was 16 years old. 5 feet of deeply unimpressive teenager in a patched gray robe, sweeping fallen leaves off the stone steps of a half-abandoned mountain temple. To anyone who happened to walk by, I was the least important person in the least important place in a crumbling old empire that had bigger problems than one skinny orphan with a broom. Which was precisely how I liked it. Because under that patched robe, 16 years of stacked system rewards were quietly humming along. I was already what this world called a celestial phenomenon cultivator, the 5th of 9 realms, at an age when the local prodigies were still very proud of themselves for lighting a candle with their minds. I could have walked down that mountain, folded the nearest warlord's army into a small unhappy square and been back before the tea went cold. I did not do that. 10 lifetimes teaches you the single most powerful technique in any world, the one no sect ever puts in its manuals, keeping your mouth shut. The mountain was called White Cloud Mountain, and the temple on it was called White Cloud Temple, and I want to be clear that temple is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. We had leaky roofs. We had a scripture library that hadn't been fully cataloged since before I was born. We had a mute old servant who cooked, a black cat named Luna who ran the place spiritually, and on paper, 12 senior disciples. On paper, that number was about to become a problem. It happened on an evening in early winter when my 11th senior brother, Chen Mingde, came stumbling across the courtyard with his face the color of old paper. Chen Mingde always looked half sick. He had been born frail and stayed that way. But this was a new kind of pale. Master is back, he said. Junior brother, Master is back. And he couldn't finish it. He didn't have to. I was already moving. Our master was the venerable Guangli, abbot of White Cloud Temple, an earthly realm cultivator and the single kindest man I had met in 10 lifetimes, which, I promise you, is a higher bar than it sounds. Months before, he had led 6 of the senior disciples down the mountain to war. The great powers of the age were tearing each other apart, and an old friendship had dragged him into it. He went to lend his strength to the state of Qin. He came back on a stretcher of lashed spears, and he came back alone. I knelt by him in the main hall while the lamps guttered, and I did the one thing I was good at that nobody knew about. I laid 2 fingers on his wrist and let a thread of my innate primordial chi slip into him, the purest yang energy this world had a name for, something I had been quietly cultivating since I was 3 years old in this body, and I felt his whole ruined meridian system light up under my touch like a city seen from a great height, and I felt, underneath it, the wound that was going to kill him, and I felt that there was nothing even I could do about it. Some things you can heal, some things have already decided how they end. Master's eyes opened. And the first thing this dying man did was look at the color of the chi coming off my fingers, and instead of asking for water, instead of asking for mercy, he smiled. So, he whispered, it really was you. Then he told me what had happened, in the flat, exhausted voice of a man spending his last coins carefully. They had helped Qin shatter the state of Han. My 10th senior brother Wang Hu, a general now, had done terrible arithmetic on a battlefield called Yike and turned 240,000 enemy soldiers into a number in a history book, and then, flush with victory, they had pushed on to strike the state of Zhao. And Zhao had been waiting. An old fox of a commander named Zhou Kai had folded them into an ambush, and in the space of an afternoon, our great senior brother Lin Changfeng had died, and 5 others with him, and master himself had taken a sword through the middle from the Zhao sword sect's own master, a man called Han Jihai. 6 brothers, gone in an afternoon, 12 on paper, and now the paper was almost blank. Come here, master said. And he pressed into my hands the abbot's seal, the little worn jade chop that meant this whole leaking, sacred, hopeless place was mine now. I said what you're supposed to say, not me. I'm the youngest. There's 3rd brother Gao Yuan. There's 10th brother Wang Hu. There's Gao Yuan, master said. Loves his own name more than he loves the Tao, and he has loved Prime Minister Shi Long's coin purse for 10 years now. Wang Hu is a living god of death, and you do not hand a temple to a sword, and Tianshu, bless him, could not survive a strong breeze. His eyes found mine and held them, clear and certain in a way the rest of him no longer was. But you, in 10 lifetimes of teaching, I have never met anyone like you. I knew the day you walked up this mountain as a baby. I have simply been waiting for you to stop pretending. And then, because a dying man has no time left to be polite about secrets, he told me who I was. There was a wooden box. Inside it, a small folded garment stiff and dark with old blood, and a jade pendant carved in the shape of a coiling dragon, with a single character cut into its belly. The character was the old word for martial. Zhao, a dead king's name. You are the posthumous son of King Zhao of Chu, master said. I want to tell you I was shocked. 10 lifetimes is a long time. Very little shocks me. But I sat there holding a dead man's blood in a box, and I felt the floor of my nice, quiet, anonymous life quietly drop out from under it. King Zhao of Chu had been a young giant of a man who died at 23 trying to lift a ceremonial bronze cauldron, because that is the kind of thing that gets you remembered. He had no acknowledged heir, but he had a woman, a palace maid, and he had planted a child before the cauldron planted him. When he died, the wolves came for the throne, and a prince named Liu Min took it with the backing of his uncle Zilong and the old queen dowager, and everyone with a competing claim was quietly, thoroughly erased. My grandmother, Queen Fenghua, erased. My mother, run down while fleeing with me still in her belly, dead the same night she gave birth to me in a ditch, and a loyal old eunuch named Sun Bo had scooped up the screaming newborn evidence and carried it up a mountain to a soft-hearted abbot, and then walked back down and vanished so that the trail would end at his own back. That was me, the evidence, the loose end that a prime minister named Shi Long had been quietly hunting for 16 years. Hide it, master breathed. Hide all of it. Grow strong. And if they ever find you, go to Wang Hu and have him take you to the king, because uncle and nephew is a thinner wall than uncle and stranger. His hand tightened on mine, one last time, with the last strength he had. Live, Jingyi. Whatever else you do with all these lives of yours, live. He died a little after midnight, smiling, which is not a thing dying men usually manage, and I have decided to take some of the credit for it. We buried him behind the temple beside the graves of the brothers who never even made it home to be buried, empty holes with names on them. And standing at that fresh mound in the cold, I counted what was left of White Cloud Temple. Me, 16, secretly a monster, officially a broom operator. 6th senior sister Mei Lia, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued and grieving hard. 9th senior sister Chao Xiaoran, gentle, furious, wiping her face on her sleeve. Chen Mingde, frail as a held breath. Somewhere far off, Wang Hu, still at war and not yet knowing his teacher was in the ground. And a mute servant and a cat. That was the whole army. 4 of us who could stand upright. Mei Lia wanted to go kill Han Jihai that night. 9th sister was already nodding along, both of them lit up with the particular clean rage of people who have just lost someone and want the universe to hand them a receipt for it immediately. We are 4 people, I told them, as gently as a 16-year-old can tell 2 grown women to stand down. Hanji is the sword master of an entire sect, and he is at least 3 realms above any of us that the world knows about. If we go now, we don't avenge Master. We just add 4 more empty graves to his and let his whole line end in a week. That isn't loyalty. That's a tantrum with a body count. They didn't like it. Grief never likes patience. But they trusted the seal in my hand, or they trusted Master's judgment in giving it to me, and they stood down. Half a month later, Mei Lia brought me a handful of green plums, still sour, picked from a tree near the front gate. "Third senior brother is back on the mountain," she said, watching my face. "Gao Yuan, he brought them." 10 lifetimes teaches you to hear the sentence under the sentence. Gao Yuan had been Silong's man for a decade, and Gao Yuan had come home the very moment the temple had a fresh, undefended abbot's seal changing hands and only 4 exhausted mourners to defend it. He hadn't brought plums. He had brought a market survey. He came up the path a few days later in robes far too fine for a mountain monk, smiling the smile of a man who has already decided how a conversation is going to end. He was somewhere in his 50s, 3rd senior brother, smooth and prosperous, and he looked at me the way you look at a chair you intend to sit in. "Little junior brother," he said, spreading his hands, all warmth. "The seal. It really should pass to seniority, don't you think? For the good of the sect. I'll take such good care of the old place." And then, still smiling, without the smallest change in his face, he struck. A palm of hard, trained chi aimed straight at my chest. Not a test. A killing blow dressed as a handshake. Cool, I thought. Very cool. Love that for me. I raised one finger, just the one. I let the thinnest sliver of my protective aura gather at the tip of it, a needle's worth, and Gao Yuan's beautiful killing palm met that needle and stopped as if he had punched a mountain. The chi rebounded up his own arm and threw him backward off the steps, and he landed in the dead leaves he had so recently pretended to sweep, clutching his hand. There was a small red dot burned neatly into the center of his palm, exactly 1 finger wide, like a stamp. Received. Rejected. Returned to sender. Gao Yuan stared at that mark, and then he stared at me, and all the warmth ran out of his face at once, and what was left underneath it was pure animal fear. That's protective aura. His voice cracked. "You're already at Celestial Phenomenon Realm? At 16? That's not..." "Third senior brother," I said, and I did not raise my voice, because I have found you never need to raise your voice when the other person's whole worldview is already falling down the stairs. "Come up this mountain without my leave again, and I won't stop at your hand. Go back to the Prime Minister. Tell him the temple is doing fine." He went. He scrambled up out of the leaves, and he went, and he did not look back, and Mei Lia watched him go with her mouth slightly open, because she had just watched the family baby and a sword-strong senior brother with a fingertip and a bored expression. "Junior brother," she said carefully. "What realm are you, actually?" "A helpful one," I said, and went to find a rag for the steps he'd disturbed. The rest of that first year I spent doing the least dramatic and most important thing a person in my position could do. I taught. Every day, in the scripture library, under 300,000 volumes that hadn't seen a serious student in a generation, I sat down with the 3 people I had left, and I started making them strong. Mei Lia I set on the skill of purity and naturalness, because she needed her sharp mind to cut in a straight line instead of in circles. Xiao Xiaoran, I gave the Origin Green Lotus scripture, gentle power for a gentle person, and frail Chen Mingde, I put on the Great Sun Golden Crow visualization, and quietly layered a second technique underneath it to shore up the sickly body he'd been cursed with since birth, because I had already worked out what was wrong with him, and I wasn't ready to tell him yet. "There are 4 of us," I told them, on a gray afternoon with snow coming. "Master left 4 of us, so we are going to become the 4 that were enough." It was a nice line. I even half believed it. Those first quiet years, when I wasn't teaching, I spent in the green bamboo forest on the mountain's shoulder, sitting so still and pulling my presence in so completely that the world forgot I was there. Blunt the sharpness, the old book says, untangle the knots, soften the glare, and settle into the dust of the world until you're no different from it. I got good at it. So good that the wild things stopped minding me. An eagle would land on one knee and a sparrow on the other. A green snake would drape over my shoulders like a scarf. A monkey would sit in my lap, picking through my sleeves, butterflies in my hair, all of them arranged on one motionless man like the mountain had decided to grow a very strange shrine. And then, some afternoons, I'd let go of the last thread of it and simply stop being visible at all. There and not there, a shape the eye slid right off. My sisters caught me at it once. Mei Lia came looking, walked straight through the clearing where I was sitting, and didn't see me until I said hello, at which point she left the ground by a respectable margin. After that, the two of them took to visiting the bamboo forest to test themselves against me, and I'd spend a lazy afternoon quizzing them on cultivation theory and gently thrashing them at every exercise, not to humble them, but because a student who has felt exactly how far the road goes climbs it faster than one who thinks she's near the top. They grumbled. They also got stronger every single time. Grumbling and growing are not opposites. Most of my best students did both at once, loudly. I did not, at that point, fully appreciate that the system had 84 more years of birthday presents lined up for me, and that the universe's idea of a gift had only just started getting out of hand. The next present arrived on my 17th birthday. So did the assassins. The system, as I've mentioned, has a sense of humor, and it is not a warm one. They came up the mountain in the dead hours, a dozen shadows in soft boots, the kind of men a prime minister keeps in a drawer for exactly this errand. Their commander was called Jian, and Jian headed the punishment and killing department, which is the sort of name a spy agency gives itself when it wants you to know it isn't going to bother with the punishment half. They had followed a 17-year-old cold trail all the way to my front door, and the trail had a name on it. The Martial King's posthumous child. Me. Still me. Always me. They found me sitting in the courtyard, apparently a soft, sleepy teenager, actually the worst possible thing they could have found. One of them ghosted up behind me and laid both palms flat against my back to blow my heart out through my ribs, and my birthday present chose that exact moment to unwrap itself. Innate Tao body, the system announced, destined for sainthood, functionally invincible in close quarters. The assassin's killing palms met my newly perfected skin, and a wall of golden light simply decided he was in the wrong and flung him backward into a pine tree hard enough to rearrange his understanding of trees. I stood up. I want to be honest with you. I did not agonize about this. These men had come to finish a job they'd started by running my pregnant mother into a ditch. I killed all of them but one, quickly and without theater, because I'm a storyteller now, not a butcher, and the details don't earn anyone anything. The one I kept was Jian. I put a foot on his chest, not hard, just enough that his own ribs explained the situation to him, and I asked him questions, and Jian, who had run out of both options and companions, told me. He had been one of the original knives 17 years ago, one of the men who hunted the eunuch and my mother through the dark. Recently, he had finally run down old Sun Bo, the loyal servant who'd carried me up this mountain, and found that Sun Bo had swallowed his own tongue and died rather than say one useful word. So Jian had come to the last place the trail could point, here, to search a mountain for a child who was, at that moment, standing on his sternum. Is he? Jian wheezed, actually laughing, blood on his teeth. Is he here? Is he? He's fine, I told him. Thank you for asking. And then I finished the last loose thread from the night I was born, and the trail went cold in the only direction that mattered, except a dozen corpses is its own kind of loose end. Chen Mingde came out and helped me carry them, quiet and gray and not asking, and while we worked I finally told my frail 11th brother the thing I'd been sitting on. His whole life of sickness wasn't weakness. He'd been born with a pure yin origin qi, a rare and freezing thing, the exact opposite of my pure yang, and it had been slowly killing him from the inside since childhood, and it was also, if he ever learned to turn it around, the single greatest cultivation gift on this mountain. Tell no one, I said. He nodded. He was good at telling no one. It's a family trait. Far away in the capital, Zilong got a report that his great commander Jian had walked up White Cloud Mountain and never walked back down, and I imagine he sat with that for a while in a cold room, and I imagine the thought that surfaced was the same one that had been surfacing for 17 years, a little louder each time. The Martial King's posthumous child. Is he really still alive? My 18th birthday answered a question nobody had asked extremely loudly. The reward that year was called the Great Changkun Sword Formation. 7 swords, each one a named soul of a blade. Heaven and earth, sun and moon, yin and yang, world, big picture, emperor and empress, mysterious. Of those who enter the formation, the system noted cheerfully, none return. I summoned them for the first time up on the peak, mostly out of curiosity, and 7 pillars of sword ki tore straight up into the sky and rang the whole mountain range like a struck bell. My disciples felt it and came running with their faces white, which was flattering. Less flattering was the man standing at the foot of the mountain at that precise moment, watching 7 divine swords announce themselves to the entire province, while an aide beside him breathed, "My lord, that sword key, that's the pattern from the Luguan canon, the lost one." And the man decided, then and there, to climb up and see this monk for himself. The man was Zilong. I received my mortal enemy at a tea table, which is, when you think about it, the correct way to receive a mortal enemy. Neither of you can reach for a weapon without spilling something. He was old, my grandmother's murderer, silk-robed and heavy-lidded and enormously careful, and he studied my face over the rising steam for a long moment before he spoke. "You know," he said, "you remind me of an old friend of mine, from the Qin royal house, a long time ago. Cool, I thought. Very cool. He's here about my face. Monks hear that a lot, I said. We all start to look alike once we shave our heads. Tea? We fenced like that for the better part of an hour, and I want you to understand the beautiful, ridiculous shape of it. Neither of us could show a single card. He couldn't say, I think you're the dead king's bastard, and I have come to erase you, because if he was wrong, he'd just insulted a powerful young cultivator for no reason. And if he was right, well, he'd seen the 7 swords too. And I couldn't say, I know you butchered my grandmother and hunted my mother into her grave, because Abbot Xuanjingyi had no reason on earth to know any such thing. So instead, we talked about the weather in hell. The 7 pillars of sword ki, he said, warming his hands on the cup. The whole province felt them. My aide swears they match a cannon that supposedly burned 20 years ago in a certain destroyed school. Curious thing for a mountain temple to be holding. The mountain's full of old things, I said. I inherited most of them. I couldn't tell you where half of it comes from. Monks aren't good record keepers. We're contemplative. Contemplative, he repeated, tasting the word like he suspected it of something. And such a young abbot, you can't be 20. It's remarkable. A boy your age holding a seal like this. Your master must have seen something in you. He saw that I was cheap to feed, I said, and that I didn't complain. Sect. Leadership is mostly logistics, Chancellor. You'd be surprised. He smiled at that, because he was too smart not to, and then he set the trap he'd climbed the mountain to set, gentle as a man laying down a coin. There was a commander of mine, Jian, came up this way on an errand not long ago and simply stopped. No letters, no body, nothing. You wouldn't have crossed paths with a man like that? Hard face, harder company. Missing? I said. On my mountain? I let my eyes go wide and mild. Chancellor, Qin law is the strictest in the world, and I am one humble monk with a broom and 3 grieving juniors. When exactly am I supposed to have found the time to kill a commander of the punishment and killing department? And I let my thumb come to rest, just for a breath, on the little jade abbot's seal at my belt, the one the late king of Qin himself had once granted this temple, and I turned it a quarter turn under his gaze, and I said, mild as milk, though I'll tell you, the sword in this poor monk's hand is really quite sharp. Sharp enough that even the toughest, oldest head comes right off if it ever leans too far over my tea table. Not that such a thing would ever happen. We're contemplative. For one heartbeat, the whole conversation stood on the edge of a knife, and both of us felt it, and neither of us looked down. Silong looked at my thumb on that seal, and he laughed. A real laugh, delighted almost. The laugh of an old wolf who has just met a young wolf and rather enjoyed it. And then, because he was one of the great political animals of the age, he did the thing I did not expect. He offered me a job. Come serve Qin, he said. A talent like yours, wasted on a leaky roof. Come down and be a general's peer. Help an old man keep the court in balance. Then he finished his tea and left, and halfway down the mountain, I would learn much later, he concluded that I could not possibly be the remnant he was hunting. The dead king's child would have his father's face, and I looked nothing like the late king. No. This was just a monstrously gifted young monk, and a monstrously gifted young monk plus a general named Wang Hu would make a lovely counterweight against his rival Lord Huayang. He went home pleased. He went home having taken tea with the one person alive who most wanted him dead, and having decided we could do business. I sat with the empty cups for a while after he left. 10 lifetimes, and I still had to sit very still and breathe, because the hardest thing I have ever cultivated is not any technique in that library. It's patience with a face I want to put a sword through. A month later, a different old friend came up the path, and this one I was actually glad to see. Wang Hu, my 10th senior brother. In the world's eyes, the rising terror of the age, a Qin general who won battles the way water wins arguments with rock. To me, something much smaller and much older than that. When I first came up this mountain as a baby and grew into a strange, too quiet child who unsettled the other students, there had been exactly one senior who didn't treat me like something washed up wrong. Wang Hu, a grim, friendless boy himself, already too fond of the parts of the sword manuals other children skipped, and the two of us had found each other the way lonely children do, by simply sitting near each other and not requiring anything. We spent years cross-legged in that same scripture library, him reading war, me reading everything, neither of us admitting we'd have been unbearably alone without the other one in the room. He used to save me the window seat because I liked the light. I used to steal him extra buns because the kitchen shorted the unpopular kids. That was the whole friendship. It was enough to build the rest of a life on. He came up the mountain now, still in travel dust, and the first thing he did, before he even greeted me, was walk around behind me and quiz me on Sun Tzu like I was still that 9-year-old at the window, and I answered like I was too, because some grooves you never wear out of. Then the second thing he did was drop a bundle of silk in my lap. Inside were 3 chapters of the lost teachings of Ziguang, the old Devil Valley master, writings that had never been passed to a living soul. Won them, Wang Hu said, with the closest thing his face did to a smile. In a wager, from a man who thought he understood odds. That was Wang Hu's idea of a homecoming gift. Most people bring wine. We knelt at Master's grave together, and I watched my brother press his forehead to the cold dirt and make a promise in a very quiet voice, which is always how the loudest promises are made. He swore he would make the state of Zhao pay for Master and the 6 brothers 100 times over, and kneeling beside him, I felt 2 things at once, the way you do with people you love who frighten you. I felt the grief, which was clean, and under it I felt the old thing coming back into him, the thing Master had warned me about, the childhood bloodlust of a boy who had always been just a little too comfortable with the arithmetic of corpses, a living god of death, one general's fame built on 10,000 quiet bones. He caught me up on the shape of the world while he was there, because Wang Hu treated politics the way he treated terrain, as something to be read before you march across it. Xie Long was pulling every string in Qin, handing himself fiefs and titles, stacking his own kin into every office that mattered. The king had even flirted with a scheme to crown himself Western Emperor, while the eastern state of Qi crowned its king the Eastern Emperor, the 2 of them splitting the whole world down the middle like a melon. It won't last, I told him, and it didn't. The whole grand title got quietly walked back within the year, because the other kingdoms took one look at 2 men declaring themselves gods and decided, reasonably, not to attend. Farce, all of it. I told Wang Hu the only real work was the slow, patient kind, growing strong and waiting for the age to ripen, and that the man who kept his head down while the emperors played dress-up would be the one still standing when the game ended. Be careful, I told him before he left, and I didn't mean of enemies. Zilong's name is louder than the king's now. In this world, being the sharpest sword in a jealous man's house is not a safe place to stand. He nodded like a man nodding at weather. He did not hear me. They never hear you about the important things until the important things are already happening. He went back to his wars. And 3 months later, on an ordinary snowbound afternoon, my quiet mountain met the most dramatic man I would ever recruit. I had been sitting by the frozen pond reading Zhuangzi, the chapter about free and easy wandering, about the great bird whose wings darken the sky, and the reading had gotten into my hands the way it sometimes does, and I had, without entirely deciding to, made the pond stand up. The water rose in a column and then unfolded, and for a few breaths there hung over the ice a perfect glassy replica of the whole mountain, temple and pavilions, and the little bridge, every leaf, right down to a small furious water sculpture of Luna the cat, who took immediate and lasting offense at being rendered in liquid. It was a very peaceful afternoon. It stopped being peaceful when Chen Mingde came flying backward across that bridge with a sword through the air a hand's width behind him. The man chasing him had a beard you could lose a bird in, and the swagger of someone who has been the strongest person in every room for 20 years. He was, it turned out, the #1 hero of all Guanzhong, a genuine celestial phenomenon cultivator, and he had come up my mountain to plant a flag and start his own sect on the ashes of mine, and he had opened negotiations by putting a sword at my frail brother's heart. The blade was already moving. It was going to go straight through Tian Shu's chest. I did not hurry, because I no longer have to. I came down off the air and I caught the racing sword between 2 fingers, the way you'd catch a fly that had gotten cocky, and it stopped, humming, a finger's width from my brother's robe. The bearded man's eyes went very wide. He threw a palm of true ki at me on pure reflex, all his decades of pride behind it, and my protective aura returned it to sender with interest. And then I simply let my presence settle over him, the full weight of it. 10 lifetimes pressing down like the sky sitting on his shoulders, and the #1 hero of Guanzhong folded to his knees on the ice. But here is the thing that made me like him. He didn't beg for his life. He looked up at me, this proud, ridiculous man on his knees in the snow, and what came out of him was not fear. It was hunger. Take me as your disciple, he said. I've spent my whole life being the strongest man in the mud. I don't want to be strong anymore. I want to be free. I heard White Cloud Mountain holds the 4 great arts of old Luguan, and I heard a man could learn here how to wander the world carefree as an immortal, wanting nothing. He pressed his forehead to the ice. Teach me how to want nothing, and I'll sweep your steps for the rest of my life. I looked at this man who'd been beating my brother down a bridge 90 seconds ago, now asking to be taught how to stop. When things reach their extreme, Master used to say, they turn into their opposite. The strongest man in the mud, dreaming of weightlessness. Fine, I said. One test. For 1 month, you catch me 30 silverfish a day out of that frozen stream, with your hands. No ki, no technique, no cheating. If you can be that patient, we'll talk. He stared at me like I'd asked him to empty the sea with a spoon. Then this legendary warrior rolled up his silk sleeves, walked out onto the ice, and plunged his bare arms into water cold enough to stop a heart. because some people spend their whole lives looking for someone who will finally tell them exactly what to do. He lasted the month. Of course he did. The first week he was furious, and it showed in the water, big angry splashing that scared every fish in the province. He came up each night with 3, 4, 5 silverfish, nowhere near 30, and glared at me like the shortfall was my doing. The second week he went quiet. The third week I watched from the pavilion as the #1 hero of Guangzhong knelt motionless at the edge of a frozen stream for 6 hours without moving, without chi, just a man and the cold and the waiting, and I understood he'd finally stopped fighting the test and started becoming it. That's the whole trick of asceticism, and nobody can teach it to you. They can only put you at the edge of a cold stream until you teach it to yourself. On the 30th day, he came to me blue-handed and half-frozen and grinning like a boy who's found the thing he was born for, and he set down a string of exactly 30 silverfish, and he said, "I don't want to stop. Even now, I could sit at that stream another year." And I knew he was ready, because the man who no longer needs the reward is the only man you can safely give power to. I took him as my first true disciple, and I gave him a Tao name to grow into, Rongxuanzi, the one who wanders free. He wept when I said it, this enormous bearded warrior, because nobody had ever handed him a name that was a promise instead of a threat. He would spend the next several decades toppling kingdoms for me. Freedom is complicated. I never had the heart to tell him that the freest man on my mountain would end up doing more of my heavy lifting than anyone alive. He figured it out on his own, eventually, and stayed anyway, which is the only kind of loyalty worth having. The system, meanwhile, kept unwrapping itself, and I want to take a moment to explain what a birthday is like when you're me, because it is genuinely one of the stranger recurring experiences of my very long existence. Every year I survived, it paid out, and it did not pay out in socks. One year it handed me the 9 heavens divine jades, spirit stones so potent a single one could quietly grow itself a human body if you left it alone in a lake long enough, which, spoiler, one of them eventually did. Another year, a technique to grow a living clone of myself. Another, a fire that unmade whatever it touched. Another, an entire scripture the notes described as unusable until after ascension, which is the system's idea of a save the date. Picture it. You blow out a candle and the universe leans in and whispers, "Here is a power that can end a civilization. Do try to survive the year. Happy birthday. Standard Tuesday." Somewhere around my 400th of these, across all my lives, I stopped being amazed and started keeping a filing system. This one's for breaking through a gate. This one's for later. This one goes in the drawer marked things too dangerous to use before I understand them, which is a large drawer. A lesser man would have gotten drunk on it. I'd been drunk on it in an earlier life, and I'd learned the hard way that the fastest way to die with a cheat is to forget it's a cheat and start thinking it's you. So I fed the jades into the jade purity immortal technique and climbed, gate by patient gate, up a ladder most of this world didn't know how to top. I was 30 years old, and I had a temple, 3 grieving siblings turning slowly into powers in their own right, a legendary bearded fish catcher, a cat with a grudge, a drawer full of apocalypses, and a debt to a dead swordmaster that I had not forgotten for one single day. It was time to start paying people back. I called everyone to Master's grave and said the word out loud for the first time in 14 years. Revenge. And every single one of them volunteered on the spot. My grieving sisters, my frail brother, even the fish catcher, all of them ready to march on the state of Jianghu that afternoon. It was very moving. It was also completely useless, because the man who had killed our master, the sword Saint Han Jihai, had spent those 14 years climbing too, and he was now a heaven-reaching cultivator with an entire sword sect at his back. So I picked one man, Wen Qing, my first true disciple, who wanted so badly to be free and kept proving he was born to serve. I put the great Qianxia sword formation into a lacquered casket, all 7 souls, and I put the casket in his hands. "Go to the capital of Jianghu," I said. "Don't sneak, don't poison. Walk up to Han Jihai in front of the whole world, tell him whose student you are, and take his head with Master's own inheritance. Come back alive, that's the test." He was gone more than a year, and I will not pretend the waiting was comfortable, even for a man who has waited 900 years for various things. Around then, the system handed me an ancient tree of life, which I planted, and a monkey adopted me, which I named Misty, and a neighboring outfit called the Tai sect sent a gilded invitation to their once-in-20 years sword tournament, which I declined because I had a very strict policy against showing anyone what I could actually do. Then one gray morning, Wen Qing came back up the path, thinner and older around the eyes, carrying 2 things. The first was a box. Inside the box was the head of Han Jihai, Master's revenge, 14 years cold, finally warm again. The second was a boy, a skinny, silent, half-starved orphan of maybe 10, with the rarest thing Wen Qing had ever felt in a child, a natural sword bone, the kind of talent that comes along once a generation. "Found him on the road," Yan said. "Couldn't leave him. I looked at the boy, and the boy looked back at me with the flat, wary eyes of someone the world had already tried to break, and I felt the old tug I'd felt on this exact mountain about myself 16 years and one lifetime ago. His name? I asked. The boy said nothing, so I gave him one. Hao Ming. Peace, safety, the thing nobody had ever given him. He would become my second true disciple, and one day a very great deal more than that. But that morning, he was just a hungry kid, learning that a roof could belong to him. I laid Hanji Hai's head at Master's grave. It's done, I told the dirt. Your great revenge is done. Wen Qing did it, and he did it right, in the open, with your own 7 swords, and he came home. Yan told me the whole of it that night. Over wine, he didn't really drink. I didn't sneak, he said. You told me not to sneak, so I didn't. I walked into the middle of the Zhao capital in daylight, and I stood outside the sword sect's own gate, and I called him out by name. Told the whole street who my master was, and my master's master, and that I'd come for a 14-year-old debt. He turned the cup in his fingers. He came out laughing, a heaven-reaching sword saint laughing at a man 3 whole ranks beneath him, asked me if White Cloud Temple had run so low it was sending him children. And then I opened the casket. A ghost of the old grin crossed his beard. Master, I have never in my life felt anything like those 7 swords coming off their leash all at once. He stopped laughing about a heartbeat before the end. The whole sect saw it. That was the point, you said. Let it be seen. The grin faded. They sprang their ambush the instant he fell, of course. The whole sect at my back on a killing street. I cut my way out. I'm still not entirely sure how. Some of it I did with my eyes shut, honestly, just following the swords. He looked at me. I didn't enjoy the ambush. But him, the saint, the one who put a sword through Master. Him I enjoyed. Is that wrong? No, I said. That one you were allowed to enjoy. He also brought the news riding the roads. My brother Wang Hu had taken the capital of Chu, sacked the great southern city of Yingdu, and been made Lord Wan for it. Lord Wan, the tallest tree in the whole forest, and I sat in the dark and thought, the wind always finds the tallest tree first. I didn't say it out loud. Some worries you keep. That was one revenge paid. I still had the other one. And the other one was harder, because you cannot simply send a bearded disciple to walk into the throne room of Qin and behead the prime minister of the realm in front of the king. Xilong was too well guarded, too powerful, and too public. A flying sword through his window would bring the whole machinery of the state down on a mountain I intended to protect for another 70 years. So I didn't use a sword. I used a dream. Somewhere in there, the system had handed me 2 of the most useful presents it would ever give. The dream entry technique, which let me walk into a sleeping mind, and the enlightenment technique, which could raise the understanding of any living thing once, permanently. I tried the second one out on Luna, mostly to see what would happen, and what happened was that my temple cat woke up with a soul, origin key threading through her whiskers, human speech unspooling in her furious little head, and an opinion about absolutely everything. Within a week, she had appointed herself Queen of the Mountain and begun issuing edicts about the quality of the fish. I had wanted a familiar. I had acquired a landlord. The first one, the dream, I saved for the king of Qin. For 3 years, most nights, while a king named Liu Min slept in the deepest heart of the palace of Qin, he dreamed of his own dead brother, my father, King Zhao, the young giant who died lifting a cauldron before either of us was anything. I built him carefully out of memory and old portraits, and I never once let him show his face, just a broad, familiar back at the edge of the lamplight, a voice the king had grieved for decades, saying the same thing over and over into the dark. I will not rest while Xilong stands. He took everything. He is taking it still. You have to understand that I did not invent the king's fear. I only watered it. Liu Min already lay awake over Xilong, a prime minister whose name outshone the throne, whose 4 noble kinsmen strangled the court, whose shadow had grown so long the king had started to feel cold standing in his own hall. All I did was give that fear his dead brother's voice and let it ripen, night after night, for 3 patient years, until the king woke one dawn drenched in sweat and thought, for the first time, not in fear, but in cold decision. The late king had a son once, a queen once. Xilong, you should not have. A month later, Wang Hu came home to White Cloud Mountain, and his hair had gone gray, and the grim engine of him had stalled. Xilong was dead, executed, stripped, ended by the king's own order. And Wang Hu, who had been Xilong's most famous sword for 30 years, had gone down with him by association, dismissed from his command, left with nothing but the empty honor of that Lord Wan title and an order to go home and be quiet. He sat in my courtyard, my god of death, suddenly looking every one of his years, and he did not understand how the ground had moved. I did. I had moved it. Half of my blood debt, my grandmother and my mother, paid in full, and paid by the very hand that once ordered them erased, and not a single sword of mine ever left its sheath. I didn't tell Wang Hu that, obviously. What I did was pour him tea and quietly teach him the skill of purity and naturalness, the gentle one, the one that cools a boiling heart, because I could see the killing arithmetic still running behind my brother's eyes even in disgrace, and I loved him, and I was afraid of what he would do to the world and to himself if nobody ever taught him how to be still. It didn't take. But I wanted on the record that I tried, before everything that came after. Years slid by on the mountain the way they do when a place is finally at peace. My sisters aged well, Mei Lia into her 50s with a tongue that could still strip paint, Chao Xiaoran softening at the edges, Chen Mingde thin as ever but no longer coughing blood because we'd turned his freezing curse into a foundation. I'd taken to holding what my disciples grandly called salons. I'd sit under the trees of an afternoon and unspool the nature of the Tao, heaven and earth and man, the whole architecture of everything, and my students would gather around with their brushes and their earnest faces to catch wisdom. The trouble was that I had 1,000 years of it, and it poured out faster than any human head could bail, and about an hour in, I'd look up from some point about the interpenetration of the 10,000 things and find the entire front row wearing the identical glazed expression of people whose skulls have been gently, lovingly overfilled past the drain. Even Luna, who attended purely to judge, would eventually tip over sideways on her rock in a small, furry surrender. Master, Chen Feng asked me once, very carefully, the way you approach a large truth. How do you know so much? I looked at that plain, stubborn, forgotten boy, and I very nearly told him, 900 years, kid, I've had a lot of afternoons. But some answers a student isn't ready to carry, so instead I said, I paid attention for a very long time. That's the whole secret. There isn't a shortcut, and anyone who sells you one is selling you a hole. He wrote that down. He wrote everything down. It's why the forgotten ones win. I was, all things considered, content. Which is when Hao Ming came sprinting into the courtyard to tell me 200 armed men in black were climbing my mountain. At the head of them was an old ghost, Gao Yuan, the same third senior brother I'd stamped off my steps with one finger 20 years before, except the intervening decades had been busy. He had gelded himself to worm deeper into the palace, fed Zilong's secrets for years, and then, when the wind changed, personally poisoned the very patron he'd served, and climbed over the body into Zilong's old spycraft, until now he stood at the head of the Central Chariot Bureau, master of the whole punishment and killing apparatus of Qin. Somewhere in a dusty archive he'd found the 20-year-old case of a Commander Jian who walked up White Cloud Mountain and never came down. And here he was, come to reopen it, to avenge his humiliation, and to finally strip the temple of the Luguan scriptures he'd always believed were his by seniority. Wang Hu, home in his disgrace, took one look down the mountain and told me exactly who Gao Yuan was now. That's the man who killed Zilong, my brother said with a soldier's flat contempt. Poisoned his own master to take his chair. Careful, junior brother. He wears the king's authority now. Kill the king's favorite dog and even a saint pays a price. I heard him. I just also had a mountain to keep. Wen Qing met them on the bridge and would not let them cross, and Gao Yuan, who understood only 2 languages, tried the first one, which was bribery. Gold. Rank. Women. A general's commission. Wen Qing looked at the #1 spy master of Qin offering him the world and said, roughly, that he'd already found the only thing he wanted, and it was on top of this mountain, and would the eunuch please lower his voice? Some of us were trying to have a nice day, so Gao Yuan switched to his second language. He stood at the foot of my steps and declared, in the ringing voice of a man who has practiced accusations, that Abbot Xuan Jingyi was a spy for the 6 kingdoms, a rebel against Great Qin, and that the whole nest of us was to be arrested. Then he pointed, and 200 black-clad guards drew their blades and charged up the mountain. I raised a hand, and the stream came up to meet them. I'd been reading water for a very long time by then. The whole mountain brook rose in a single sheet, a curtain of living water, and it folded over the charging column and simply held them there, 200 men suspended mid-stride inside a wall of it, drowning on dry land, their swords hanging useless in a current that would not let go. That should have ended it. But Gao Yuan, watching his men hang in the water, did something I honestly hadn't expected. He laughed. And he unveiled the trump he'd climbed all those bodies to earn. He was, he announced, a cultivator of the 9th grade of the heavenly human realm now, one single step from becoming a land immortal, armed with a technique out of the royal Qin arsenal. You were strong once, little junior brother, he sneered up at me, but I am one step from immortality. Kneel, give me the Luguan cannon, or I peel this mountain down to the roots. He thought he was standing at the top of the ladder. He had no idea the ladder had another whole section, and that I was sitting on the last rung of it drinking tea. 3rd senior brother, I said, who told you I was heavenly human? And I turned the curtain into swords. The wall of water broke apart into more than 1,000 blades of it, each one edged and screaming, and they fell on the black guards like a rain that had opinions, and in the space of a breath the 200 were down, and only Gao Yuan was left standing in the ruin of his little army, with the water rising around his ankles and the arithmetic finally, catastrophically completing itself behind his eyes. That's not heavenly human, he whispered. One step from immortal, could it be? Are you already a land immortal? I was. 37 years old, in the 9th realm, Saint-Pierre, the kind of thing this world produced maybe once in an age. There were stories that the old sages, Laozi and Zhuangzi themselves, had reached it young. There were no stories about anyone else. And Gao Yuan, my sneering, fame-drunk senior brother, spent the last second of his life understanding that the finger that had stamped his palm 20 years ago had been holding back the entire time out of sheer politeness. One water sword. That was all it took, in the end, mid-plea. Master's old book thief, the man who poisoned his own patron, gone into the stream he'd charged up. My disciples stared. Wang Hu stared. Even a god of death can be impressed by the right kind of quiet. And young Hao Ming, barely more than a boy, looked at me standing ankle-deep in a resolved massacre and said, half to himself, I'm going to reach that. A land immortal. Like Master. I let him keep the ambition. Everyone needs a mountain to climb, even the ones already standing on one. But Wang Hu had been right about one thing. I had just killed the king's favorite dog. And kings do not enjoy learning that their reach ends at the foot of a particular mountain. The reckoning came faster than I expected, and it came wearing a crown. The king of Qin was named Liu Min, and he was my uncle, though he didn't know it yet. And he was, at that moment, extremely upset that someone had drowned 200 of his men and his favorite spy master on a mountain he technically owned. He nearly came in swinging. What slowed him down was an old woman. Before the king marched, my brother Wang Hu went and knelt before the queen dowager, Liu Min's mother, the Chu-born matriarch who had ruled Qin from behind the throne for a generation before her own son quietly took her power away. 30 years ago, on this very mountain, a young Wang Hu had pulled her and a small frightened boy prince out from under a pack of wolves. She remembered. She always remembered debts, which is how she had survived so long. She agreed to speak for me, and she gave Wang Hu a cold, accurate warning to carry back. The king would offer the abbot a place at his side, and if the abbot refused it, then not even a land immortal would leave that meeting alive. Then, having spent the last of her influence, the old dowager asked her son to let her retire out of the capital entirely because she had watched him purge everyone else and she knew precisely whose name was next on the list. He wept, and he let her go. Liu Min was not a kind man, but he had loved his mother in the way powerful men love the thing they are about to sacrifice. Wang Hu rode back up my mountain half out of his mind with worry. The king was coming in person, he told me. 30,000 troops, and with him, Feng Huzi, the only other land immortal in all of Qin, a white-bearded relic centuries old, a Chu sword master who had watched the legendary blades of antiquity being forged and who had once broken an entire army with a single sword. Junior brother, Wang Hu begged, for once in your endless life, run. I've been waiting for the king of Qin, I told him, for a very long time. Because here was what my brother, panicking, couldn't see. The dowager's exile meant Liu Min now held absolute, unchallenged power, and a man with absolute power does not fly into rash murders, he calculates. And I held a card that turned the whole board over. I was the dead King Zhao's son. I had my father's blood-stained swaddling and my grandmother's dragon jade, and for 3 years I had been walking through this very king's dreams as his beloved dead brother. I hadn't been hiding from this meeting. I had been building it. He came to the foot of the mountain with his 30,000 banners, and I sent the 7 swords down to greet him. They poured off the peak in a river of light and hung in the sky over his army, and the message was not subtle. The king of Qin could bring his 30,000, but the king of Qin was going to climb my mountain on his own 2 feet. He dismounted. A vanguard general, offended on his master's behalf, threw himself up the path at Chenmingde, and the 7 swords descended and shaved every hair from the general's head without breaking his skin, a haircut as a diplomatic note. The old man at the king's side, though, was the one who mattered, and the old man was staring at my swords like a starving man at a feast. Feng Huzi, the only other land immortal in all of Qin, centuries old, a Chu sword master so ancient he claimed to have stood in the forge yards and watched the legendary blades of antiquity being hammered out of star metal, the swords whose names outlived the smiths and the kings both. He had broken armies with a single blade once, long ago, and then he had walked away from the world to grow old on a quiet mountain of his own, because that is what the truly strong do when they finally understand there's nothing left down here worth drawing on. And here was this relic, this living legend, looking at my 7 Jianghu swords hanging in the sky, and I watched something move across his face that I recognized because I'd felt it myself, the specific ache of an old collector who thought he'd already seen every wonder the world had, meeting one more. Those are real, he breathed, more to himself than the king. Then he leaned to Liu Min and murmured what a centuries-old man murmurs when he's just recalculated everyone's odds. Your Majesty, the young abbot is a land immortal, without question. And those swords are older and better than anything your armies have ever carried. Go up this hill as a guest. I will not raise my hand against the man who commands those, and if I will not, 30,000 soldiers are simply 30,000 ways to embarrass yourself. So the king of Qin walked up to my courtyard, and we faced each other, uncle and nephew, neither of us saying the true thing yet. He led with anger, because kings do. He demanded I answer for Gao Yuan and his 200, and he let his aura off its leash, the full pressure of a land immortal monarch, and he told me he would flatten this mountain and everyone on it. I let it wash over me and did not move a muscle, because I have stood in the actual doorway of death 9 separate times, and a king's temper is not comparatively very frightening. Gao Yuan betrayed the sect and murdered his own patron, I said. I was cleaning my own house. Then he changed tactics and offered me the very post Gao Yuan had died holding, master of the Central Chariot Bureau, all forgiven, come serve Qin. I declined. I liked my carefree life, I told him. I intended to keep it. His face began to close, and I saw the dowager's prophecy start to come true behind his eyes, the decision to stop asking and start destroying. So before it could finish forming, I said the quiet part. I know I'm not going to die today. And I set the dragon jade pendant on the tea table between us. The little coiling dragon with that single martial character cut into its belly. My grandmother's jade, my father's name. The king stopped breathing. He picked it up with hands that had gone unsteady, this man who had ordered so many deaths, and he turned it over and found his dead brother's personal mark, the seal of King Zhao of Chu, the giant who died lifting a cauldron before either of us was grown. And I watched 3 years of engineered dreams and one true fact land on him all at once. The late king had a son. The late king's son lived. The recurring dream of his grieving brother's voice had not been grief at all. It had been real. You, he said. You're my brother's, you're your nephew, I said. Yes. Old Feng Huzi actually sat down. He had come expecting to help murder a rogue immortal and had instead walked into a royal family reunion, and even a centuries-old sword saint has limits. And then the king of Qin did the thing that told me he had, somewhere under all that cold arithmetic, a heart. He offered me everything. Come to the palace, nephew. Stand second only to the throne itself. Uncle and nephew will swallow the 6 kingdoms whole, and in 100 years, when I'm gone, great Qin is yours. He offered me an empire. He meant it. I gave it back. I don't want the throne, I told him. I have never wanted the throne. I want exactly one thing, and it is this leaking temple and the quiet to seek my Tao in. From this day there is no posthumous son of King Zhao. There is no lost prince. There is only Abbot Xuanjingyi, a monk on a mountain who would like very much to be left alone. Promise me that no one ever troubles White Cloud Mountain again, and we are finished here. He searched my face for the lie, the angle, the play, because everyone he'd ever known had an angle. There wasn't one. In the end, he believed me, because the truth has a particular flatness to it that liars can never quite counterfeit. He swore the temple would be safe. He swore my name would die with him. He set the jade back in my palm, and he gathered his 30,000 baffled soldiers, and he went home having come to kill an enemy, and leaving having found and lost a family in the same hour. I stood in the empty courtyard afterward, and looked at the dragon jade in my hand for a long moment, my father's name, my grandmother's death, my one ticket to a throne. Then I closed my fist and ground it to powder, and let the wind take it off the mountain. My disciples were amazed later that I'd untangled an army and a king without a single one of us bleeding. They wanted to know how. I told them the truth, which is the only magic trick I've never gotten tired of. The result is what matters. Not the cleverness, not the credit. The result. Everyone I loved was still breathing, and the empire had agreed to forget I existed, which was all I had ever asked of it. I had bought myself 60 more years of quiet. I fully intended to spend them growing flowers and reading books and slowly, patiently, becoming immortal. The world, as usual, had other plans, and the world's plans were named Jianghu and Changping and 400,000 men. A decade passed first, the good kind. I crossed into the soul transformation realm. A giant white spirit eagle fell wounded out of the sky onto my mountain after losing a fight, and my monkey Misty begged me so pitifully to save it that I did, and the eagle repaid me by moving in permanently and bringing Hao Ming snake gallbladders as gifts, which is apparently how eagles say thank you. The system handed over the 9-character Taoist mantra, the one where your words simply become law when you speak them, and a dragon tree that turned the whole lake spiritual when I planted it. 10 quiet years. I should have known the bill was coming. because across those same 10 years, I had been quietly making Wang Hu into a monster. I'd taught him techniques in secret, fed my disgraced brother enough cultivation to climb back into the top rank of Qin's generals, and the king, watching this supposedly retired old soldier become terrifying again, kept him benched out of pure nervousness. Until Qin and the state of Zhao locked horns at a place called Changping and could not break the deadlock. Zhao had sent their finest, an old fox named Zhou Kai, the same Zhou Kai who'd ambushed and killed our master and brothers all those years ago, and Zhou Kai had dug in behind his walls in a turtle shell defense that Qin's armies broke themselves against for 3 straight years. So the king secretly unbenched his monster. He gave Wang Hu supreme command and pointed him at Changping. And I told my disciples exactly how it would go. Zhao would grow impatient with Zhou Kai's turtling. They would swap him out for someone aggressive and stupid, and the moment they did, Wang Hu would end them. I was right. I am almost always right about the shapes of things. It's the sizes I sometimes fail to imagine. Wang Hu came to me before he marched, and there was a light in him I hadn't seen since he was a boy, and it frightened me. He was going to destroy the state of Zhao that had killed our family. He asked to borrow Wen Qing, whose strength by then had quietly surpassed even Wang Hu's own. Hao Ming begged to go too. My second true disciple, the starved silent orphan Yan, had carried up the mountain. Years before, had grown into an 8-foot iron tower of a young man, quiet still, but solid now, sure of himself, in a way the road child never could have imagined. He knelt in front of me. Master, send me. I can fight. You know I can fight. I know you can fight, I said. That's not what I'm weighing. I crouched down to his level, this giant of a boy. Hao Ming, when you were small, the world did terrible things to you, and you swallowed all of it, and you've been very quiet about it for a very long time, and a battlefield is the one place in the world that reaches down your throat and pulls all of that back up. I have watched men stronger than you walk onto a field whole and walk off it in pieces that never fit back together. Wen Qing is going, and Wen Qing already knows the exact shape of his own darkness. You don't yet. And I would rather keep you home a few years too long than send you out one day too early and get back a stranger wearing your face. He didn't like it. He was young, and being kept safe feels exactly like being called weak when you're young. But he obeyed, because I'd given him the one thing the world never had, a place where the answer to trust me was always eventually proven right. He'd get his war later, and his own throne of a title with it, and he'd walk off that eventual field whole, because I made him wait until he could. That too is a different story. This mountain is nothing but the roots of 100 different stories, and I only get to tell you the trunk. I gave Yan the 7 swords and let him and Wang Hu go down the mountain, and I sent my 3 senior siblings off in another direction to find fresh disciples, and I sat on my peaceful mountain and waited for a victory. Wen Qing came back early. That was the first thing that told me something was wrong. He came back before the war was even properly over, and the man who walked up my path was not the man who'd left. The fish catcher who wanted only to be free had seen something that would not let go of him. The battle was won, he told me, won completely. And then Wang Hu had taken the 400,000 men of Zhao who had laid down their weapons and surrendered, and he had put them in the ground, all of them. 400,000 who had already given up. Only a couple hundred of the youngest boys were spared, sent home to carry the terror back to their kingdom. Yan told me the rest that night, quietly, in pieces. How the aggressive fool who replaced Zhou Kai had marched straight into Wang Hu's false retreat. How the encirclement had closed and the supply lines had been cut. How the trapped army had starved behind that ring for 46 days until it stopped, in every way that mattered, from being an army and started being something the survivors would never describe out loud. How their commander finally died leading a hopeless charge. How the rest surrendered and were counted and were ended on my brother's order, because a general with an empty treasury cannot feed 400,000 enemy mouths and cannot risk letting them go. And then my proud, free, unbreakable first disciple looked at me with wet eyes and asked the question that had chased him all the way up the mountain. I came to White Cloud to be free, he said. Not to do that. I stood in that field, master, and every night since, I hear them, the young ones, calling for help that isn't coming. His voice cracked all the way through. What have I become? Am I a devilhead now? Is that what I let you make me? I did not make a joke. There are moments the mask comes off and stays off, and a field of 400,000 is one of them. I told him the truth as I understood it, which is not the same as a comfort. Killing is woven into the Tao of this world, I said, threaded all the way through heaven and earth, and no cultivator with real power gets to keep his hands clean, because the whole point of becoming strong is to be the one who decides how the strength is used. The martial artist doesn't train to love killing. He trains so that his strength can end other people's killing. And there is only one thing that ever actually stops the endless grinding wars of this age, the wars that have fed on ordinary people for 500 years, and that thing is for one hand to finally close over all of it and force the peace. Wang Hu was building that in the most terrible way a man can build anything. 400,000 is a horror. 400,000 every generation, forever, because no one was ever strong enough to end it, is a larger one. You are not a devil head, I told him. A devil head enjoys it. You came home unable to sleep. That grief you're carrying, that is the exact thing that separates you from the men who deserve the name. Don't put it down, just don't let it put you down either. He sat with that for a long time. And in the end, because he was who he was, he squared his shoulders and asked what I needed him to do next. I gave him a letter to carry back to Jianghu, a warning about the road ahead. The treasury was empty. The army was drunk on its own victory, and an arrogant army marching on an empty stomach is an army about to lose. I was right about that too. I wish sometimes that I were wrong more often. It would mean the world surprised me, and a world that can still surprise you is a gentler place to live than the one I actually know. Wenqing went back down the mountain carrying my letter and his grief, and I stayed up on the peak and I thought about my brother Jianghu, the tallest tree in the whole forest, and I felt the wind starting to pick up. For a few years though, the mountain gave me peace, and I want to tell you about the peace, because otherwise, all you'll remember is the war. Luna the cat had by then fully consolidated her rule. She had a soul, a vocabulary, and a throne, which was the warmest flat rock in the courtyard, and she governed the monkey and the 2 white vultures and every disciple with the serene tyranny of a creature who has decided the universe is a service she is reviewing poorly. My 3 senior siblings came home from their wandering with 15 new disciples trailing behind them, boys and girls plucked off the roads of a broken age, and just like that, White Cloud Temple had students in its halls again for the first time in 30 years. I stood in the doorway and watched 15 kids fumble their first stances in the snow and felt something in my chest I don't have a clean word for. The house wasn't empty anymore. There was a scene I still keep. The 15 were lined up in the courtyard on their first morning, stiff and terrified and trying to look worthy, while Chen Mingde walked the row correcting their stances. And Luna, who had been watching from her warm rock with her tail curled around her paws, could not let it stand. She strolled down the line like a drill inspector, looked up at a boy whose knees were trembling, and said in perfect words, in the clear, cutting voice of a soul that has decided the universe owes it better, "Your center of gravity is a disgrace, and your master is watching." 3 of them fainted. 1 dropped to his knees and began, sincerely, to pray to her. A talking cat is a lot for a 14-year-old who woke up that morning still processing the idea of a talking teacher. Luna accepted the prayer as no more than her due and was insufferable about it for a solid month, taking to reviewing the disciples' morning drills from her rock and awarding scores nobody had asked for. That one, she informed me one dawn, watching the plain stubborn boy Chen Feng fall over for the 90th time trying a form the talented kids had gotten in an afternoon. No talent at all, none. It's almost impressive. He'll be here at midnight still doing it wrong. He will, I agreed. And he'll be here at dawn doing it slightly less wrong, and he'll do that every single day for 30 years, and one morning you'll look up and he'll be one of the strongest people on this mountain, and neither of us will be able to say exactly when it happened. Luna considered this. I still don't respect his footwork. You don't have to. Heaven forgot to gift him, so he's going to embarrass heaven the slow way. Those are the ones you watch, Luna, not the prodigies. The prodigies coast. It's the forgotten ones who go and rewrite the whole story when nobody's looking. I scratched her ears, which she permitted as a tax. I was one of those myself once, in an early life. It's the only reason I'm anything now. She said nothing to that, which for Luna counted as a lengthy and moving speech. Among those 15 were a few who mattered more than they knew yet. A fierce boy named Huang Tianhua, whose spirit I read at a glance as a sword that would sooner shatter than bend. A quiet girl named Mei Hua, and the one who caught at me most, a plain, slow, ferociously stubborn boy named Chen Feng, the least talented child on the whole mountain, and, without any competition, the hardest working, the kind of person the heavens forget to gift and then spend a lifetime being quietly shamed by. I sent all 3 of them, when they were ready, out into the world instead of into an army, because some blades are meant for war and some are meant for weather, and you have to know which is which before you point them anywhere. And in the middle of all that new life, the oldest life on the mountain quietly ended. Our mute servant, the old man who had cooked and swept and carried water since Master's own Lugan days, who had never in any of our memories spoken a single word, lay down one evening and did not get up. His last request he made in signs, to be buried beside Master Guangli. We did that. And when it came time to carve his stone, we all stood there and realized that in all those decades, not one of us had ever known his name. So we buried him under a blank stele, a clean stone with nothing on it, next to the master he'd followed across a lifetime and 2 temples. And I have thought since that a blank stone is not the worst way to be remembered. It means you were the kind of person who never once needed the credit. I have known emperors who could not say the same. Then the wind, which had been rising the whole time, finally reached the tallest tree. Wenqing came racing up the mountain again with word that Wang Hu's life was measured now in days. The story was an ugly one and a familiar one. After Changping, a jealous minister named Fan Sui had taken a bribe and talked the king into making peace right at the moment the killing blow was there to be struck, robbing Qin and Wang Hu of the finish. Later, the king regretted it and reopened the war and ordered Wang Hu back to the field, and Wang Hu, who had told them the moment was lost, who had warned them in my own words that an arrogant army on an empty treasury only marches to its funeral, refused to lead men to a slaughter he knew was coming. So they broke him, stripped his rank, reduced the Lord Wan to a common soldier, and drove him out of the capital in disgrace. And when the war went exactly as badly as he'd predicted, the king's humiliation curdled, and a king's curdled humiliation always needs a body. Liu Min sent a sword after his greatest general on the road. The king's landing sword, they called it, the blade a Qin ruler sends when he wants a man to open his own throat and save everyone the paperwork. Go in peace, Lord Wuan, the decree said. Kings are always most polite in the sentence where they kill you. I sent Wenqing down that mountain like a loosed arrow with the abbot's seal and 6 of the 7 swords, and I told him to run. It happened outside a place called Duyu. Fan Sui himself rode out to deliver the sword, to be sure the thing was done, and he found Wang Hu's plain carriage stopped in the road, and my brother climbed down out of it and knelt in the dust to accept his death. And here is the part that undoes me every time I tell it. Wang Hu did not rage. He knelt there, this old gray engine of a man, and he looked at the blade, and he said more or less that it was fair. 400,000 men, he said. He had put 400,000 surrendered men in the ground, and the ledger of heaven does not forget a number like that. And so, if this was the price, then he would pay it, and he had no regrets, because everything he had ever done, he had done for great Qin. And he lifted the king's sword to his own throat, and the sword of the world came down out of the sky and knocked it out of his hand. Wenqing landed in that road between my brother and his death, and he held up the abbot's seal of White Cloud Temple where Fan Sui could see it, and he said the words I had given him to say. If the king of Qin wants Wang Hu's life, let the king come to White Cloud Mountain and collect it in person. Then 6 swords unsheathed themselves and turned in a slow ring around them both, and the message was as clear as the one I'd sent the king's army years before. This man is ours. You will have to go through a land immortals mountain to touch him. Fan Sui sat his horse and looked at the 6 swords and did the arithmetic that ministers are good at. And something else moved in him too, some late private shame, because Fan Sui had wronged Wang Hu once for a bribe and had never quite gotten the taste of it out of his mouth. He let them go. He rode back to the capital and reported that Lord Wan had been rescued by the abbot of White Cloud Temple, and that there was, regrettably, nothing to be done about it. Wang Hu came home to my mountain that night, alive, for the first time in his life, truly out of the war, and we sat down and played a game of Go by Lamplight, the 2 lonely boys from the scripture library grown into 2 tired old men, and neither of us said very much because we didn't have to. I told the whole temple I'd had the king's own decree defied, and that Liu Min might come to besiege us for it or might let it lie, and that either way they should not be afraid, because I was here. And they believed me. They'd watched me turn an army and a king back down this mountain without a drop spilled. My disciples had reached the point of trusting me the way you trust the ground, which is a heavy thing to be trusted like, and I have never once taken it lightly. Down in the capital, an aging king sat with the news that he could not reach his own nephew's mountain and turned it over and over. Liu Min was old now too, and a man who feels the cold coming starts to think differently about the one relative he has left, even the one he can't command. He decided, one more time, to climb White Cloud Mountain, not with an army, just with a question. While we waited for him, Wang Hu and I went spelunking. There was a cave up on Tianyi Peak that breathed heat, and we followed it down into an underground chamber, and there in the warm dark sat an enormous egg. I knew what it was the moment I saw it, because I'd seen its kind once before, 900 years and a fallen dynasty ago. A phoenix egg, still slowly ticking with life after all this time. I set Luna to guard it, which she accepted as her clear royal due, and which meant that for the next several years, my mountain's most dangerous treasure was watched over by a house cat with a superiority complex. I want you to hold on to that egg. It matters later. Most warm things do. Then the king came, with a handful of guards and the particular quiet of a man running out of road. He was honest with me, that visit, more honest than kings usually manage. He admitted he'd been glad, in the end, that I'd saved Wang Hu, that he hadn't really wanted his greatest general's death on his hands. And then he told me his dream, the real one, the one under the crown. He wanted to crush the last of his rivals, declare himself not king but emperor, and unify the whole shattered realm under one hand at last. He wanted to be the one who ended the 500 years of war. How long? He asked me. How long until it's done? 20 years, I told him. Maybe more, not 10. He was 69 years old. We both did the subtraction in silence, and we both got the same ugly answer, so I made him the offer I had never made anyone. Step down, I said. Hand the throne to your heir. Come up this mountain. Let me teach you to cultivate, and I can give you another 20 years. Perhaps 50. Enough to see the whole thing finished with your own eyes. His head came up sharply. Abdicate? You're telling me to abdicate? I'm telling you the price. A king who steps down from the throne of Qin, he said very quietly, does not usually live to enjoy his retirement, nephew. You of all people know what this family does to the ones who let go of power. You'd be under my roof, I said. Nobody touches what's under my roof. You've seen what that means. I let that sit. But that's not really your fear, is it? You're not afraid they'll kill you. You're afraid of who you are when you're not holding it. You've had the whole world in your fist so long you don't know what your hand is for otherwise. He didn't answer, which was the answer. Here's the trade, and it's the oldest one there is, I said. Keep the crown, keep the power, hold every thread in your fist, and you have 5 or 6 years, and you die with your empire half built and hand the ruins to a son you don't trust. Or open your hand, and I give you the decades to finish it and watch it stand. You cannot have both the throne and the time. No one who ever lived has managed it. Take a year. Think, and then choose, uncle, because this is the one thing in your whole life that no amount of power lets you refuse to decide. He left with his whole face at war with itself, and I told my disciples afterward that I had not begged the king for anything. I had simply set the choice in front of him and let him be the one to hold it, because a gift a man chooses freely sits differently in him than a gift he's talked into. I promised my students, all of them, more than 100 years of life each. I keep my promises to the people who live on my mountain. It's the promises the world extracts from you that go bad. 6 months later, a decree came down, and it was the good kind. Jianghu was formally allowed to retire. Not die, retire. My brother's long war with his own king was finally, quietly over, and he got to be an old man on a mountain instead of a name on a tomb. I count that one as a win. I don't get to keep very many of the clean ones, so I keep the ledger carefully. But the king did not abdicate. Of course he didn't. In 3 more years of watching from my peak, I saw him do exactly what powerful men almost always do when offered the trade. He kept the crown and told himself he'd find another way to keep the time. He never could let go of it. The having was the whole self by then, and you cannot ask a fist to become a hand overnight. Around then, the system handed me the sword control art, the ability to send a single blade flying across hundreds of miles to end a life I'd never need to walk up to, and I filed it away, not knowing yet how soon and how tenderly I'd use it. The king came to my mountain one final time, and this time I could hear his heart failing from across the courtyard, a slow, wrong rhythm under everything he said. He was gaunt and gray, the power gone thin in him, and he'd left the bargain too late, and he knew it. 3 months, no years left to buy. He didn't ask me for them anymore. He sat across from me, an old dying king and his immortal nephew, and he asked me for something smaller and much harder. Protect it, he said. When I'm gone. Great Qin, I don't. He stopped, and something in the great cold political animal cracked, just slightly. I don't trust my son with it. He's soft. No fire. I built the strongest thing in the world, and I have to hand it to a boy who'd rather have a nice afternoon. Promise me it doesn't come apart in his hands. I'll protect it, I said. On one condition. My name stays buried. My blood stays a secret. Your son, and his son, and every king after, they never learned there was a lost prince on this mountain. I don't want the story. I only want the quiet. He almost smiled at that. You know, you're the only person I ever met who wanted less than I could give him. He looked at me a long moment, this man who had begun with a throne he seized and was ending with a single secret to give away. My brother would have liked you. He was the same. Wanted to lift a stupid heavy pot for the joy of it, not for what it got him. It got him dead, but he'd have done it laughing. His voice went quiet. I've spent my whole reign making sure you didn't exist. Turns out that's the only inheritance I have left to give. So take it, not existing. It's yours, nephew, and it's freely given. And I'm sorry it took me a whole life to have anything you'd actually want. That was the last time I saw my uncle. Liu Min, king of Qin, died in the 56th year of his reign, an old man who had held onto the throne with both hands so hard and so long that there was never a free hand left to reach for anything else. I was 57. I had watched him choose the crown over the years, the way I had once chosen the mountain over the crown, and we had each gotten exactly the life we reached for. I don't think either of us was wrong. I just know which of us slept better. I played a song for him after, not for the king. For the frightened boy his mother had once carried up my mountain away from the wolves, a very long time ago, before either of us knew what we were going to cost the world. And then the throne passed on, the way thrones do, faster and faster, toward the one Qin ruler whose name you already know, even if you've never heard a single other name in this whole story. The old king's soft son took the crown and died 3 days later, which is not a typo, it's just Qin. After him came a king called Kang, propped up by a merchant-turned-minister named He Yun, the kind of man who bought a throne the way you'd buy a promising racehorse and expected dividends. I watched all of it from my mountain and told my disciples the same thing I'd been telling them for decades. It doesn't matter how many kings die in how many years. Great Qin is going to swallow the world. Some things are the fate of the nation, and you can no more argue a river out of reaching the sea than you can argue Qin out of the empire it was always going to become. The system, keeping pace, handed me the ability to command the weather, the ability to see through solid matter, and a ranking seal art that could bind a living creature's very essence. I was 60 years old and quietly assembling the toolkit of a minor god, and I was still, officially, a man who swept his own steps. Then one afternoon, Luna came streaking across the courtyard yelling, which for a cat with a soul is a whole event, and told me there were bandits at the foot of the mountain butchering travelers on the road. A woman and a small boy, she said, cornered. I opened my starry eyes, the third eye I'd been given as a child and only lately truly mastered, and I looked down the mountain and across the miles until I could see them. A road, a ring of bandits closing, a woman with her arms around a boy of maybe 8 or 9, both of them travel-worn and out of options, and I did not like the shape of it. So I called the azure sword to my hand, and I told it where to go, and I led it off the mountain. It crossed hundreds of miles the way a thought crosses your mind. And on that faraway road, every bandit in that ring simply fell, all at once, cut down by a blade none of them ever saw, while a swordlight flickered once against the sky, and was gone. The woman knelt frozen in the dust holding her son, both of them untouched, both of them staring up at a heaven that had, for no reason they could name, reached down and spared them. I pulled the sword home and sat with what my starry eyes had shown me of their faces, and my old long memory turned over and found the match. The woman was Zuelan. The boy was her son, come home the hard way from years as a hostage in the enemy state of Jianghu, walking back to a Qin that barely remembered he existed. The boy was named Liu Yang. You know that name. Everyone who will ever live knows that name. I had just reached across 100 miles to keep the first emperor of all China alive, back when he was a scared kid on a bad road, and I did it before I'd fully worked out who he was, and I would have done it anyway. 10 lifetimes had not, it turned out, burned all the human out of me. There was still enough left to save a frightened child. I was almost relieved to find out. Luna, who had watched a sword leave the mountain and end a massacre 100 miles away and return before the tea cooled, sat very still for once and said nothing at all. Even the queen of the mountain knew when she'd seen something. 2 years later, Kang died on schedule, 3-year reign, right on the Qin timetable, and the boy from the road became king of Qin at 13, with He Yun running the state and his mother beside the throne. I sent my student Wen Qing down to open a restaurant in the capital, which sounds like a joke and was actually the best intelligence post in the realm because everyone talks over dinner and no one suspects the man refilling the wine. And I sent Hao Ming, my second true disciple, grown into a mountain of a man at the 9th grade of the heavenly human realm, down off my mountain and into the Qin army under a false name, to start climbing the ranks the honest, bloody, mortal way, because I had made a dead king a promise. I was going to protect Great Qin, and the best way to protect a thing is to already have your own people standing inside it before it knows it needs protecting. I settled in to wait and to grow, and for a while the only visitors were the interesting kind, until a furious white-haired girl kicked down my front gate looking for a way to kill a man. She looked about 15 or 16, and she was actually only 7 or 8, which tells you everything about what her life had done to her. She came up my mountain and went through my younger disciples like a scythe through wheat, not to hurt them, just to get to the front, and she planted herself in my courtyard and demanded the myriad heaven sword cannon, one of the 4 lost arts of old Luguan, as if she were owed it. Grief does that. It walks into rooms convinced the universe has a debt outstanding. I gave her the same test I give everyone, a prison of water swords. She broke it in 10 breaths. 10. That was the best raw talent I had put my hands on in this entire lifetime, and it was wrapped around a wound the size of a life. Her name was Mu Yan. Her mother had been the great master of the moon worship cult, and her mother had been murdered by the cult's own left envoy, a land immortal named Gao Xian, who wanted the leadership and practiced a slippery body-stealing art that the myriad heaven sword cannon was, as far as anyone knew, the only thing in the world that could cut through. So the child had come to the one mountain that might hold the counter to the man who killed her mother. I took her as my 4th true disciple. Not because of the talent, though the talent was frightening, because I knew exactly what she was, a small cold person locked inside her worst day, and I happened to have a 900-year specialty in people locked inside things. I taught her with a teapot. I put it in her hands, an ordinary clay pot, and I told her to hold it, and she did. gripping it so hard her knuckles went white, the way she did everything, braced against a blow. This pot, I said, is your mother's death. It's the day it happened. It's the man who did it. Everything you carry. Hold it. I'm holding it, she said, flat. Now let go. She didn't move. Her whole small body locked around that pot like I'd asked her to drop her own heart on the stones. You see, I said gently. I never told you to drop it. I told you to let go. You could set it down. You could hand it to me. You could hold it loose in an open palm and carry it 100 years without it costing you a thing. But you're strangling it. And here's the question I want you to sit with, and I don't want you to answer today because you'll answer wrong today. I touched the back of her clenched hand. What's actually trapping your hand right now, child? The pot, or your own grip on it? She glared at me with the pure fury of someone who has just felt a lock turned somewhere they didn't know they had a door, and she did not get it that day. They never get it the day you say it. That's not how the door works. You plant the sentence and you walk away and you let it grow in the dark on its own schedule. But Wen Qing took her the rest of the way. My bearded fish catcher, who had once knelt on the ice and begged me to teach him how to want nothing, sat with that frozen girl through a whole winter and told her the thing I'd needed someone to tell me 900 years before, in a life I try not to think about. The heart is a door, little sister, he said, and here's the joke of it. It only ever locks from the inside. Whatever you think is out there holding it shut, it isn't. It's your own hand on the bolt. And you can take your hand off the bolt any single moment you finally decide you're tired enough of guarding an empty doorway. One day, a while later, she took her hand off the bolt. I felt it happen from across the mountain, a small, cold star finally letting itself warm. That's a different story, and a good one, but it belongs to her, and I've learned not to spend other people's endings for them. While Mu Yan was still frozen and new, I got other visitors, and these ones came from my library. An old man walked up my path with a boy carrying a cloth-wrapped sword, and the old man was famous. Zheng Wuji, a grand elder of the divine martial way, a land immortal spoken of in the same breath as Ziguang himself. My talking animals lost their minds. Misty the monkey and the white snake had taken to calling me Supreme Emperor behind my back, and now they scampered around this legendary sage like he was a traveling show. Zheng Wuji endured it with the dignity of a man who has never once in his long life been treated as an opening act by a monkey. He wanted to challenge me, he said, politely. What he actually wanted, under 3 layers of land immortal courtesy, was my Luguan manuals, because his own dead senior brother had spent his life hunting them and died still wanting them, and the divine martial way had a very old, very guilty history with the school those manuals came from. We circled it over tea for a while, the way old cultivators do, everything wrapped in 6 polite words where 1 rude one would serve. Meanwhile, Misty the monkey sat on the roof beam directly above the famous sage and dropped pine nuts into his tea one at a time with the concentration of a master archer, and the white snake draped herself across the doorway and watched him with the flat, appraising interest of a creature deciding whether he'd fit. Zheng Wuji, a land immortal spoken of in the same breath as Ziguang, sat through all of it with the fixed dignity of a man who has realized that objecting will only make it worse. You have a great deal of, he searched for the word, wildlife. They're disciples, I said. Difficult ones. That one's failing calligraphy. At last he came to the point, and the point was a wager. If he could last 1 single exchange against me, he'd earned the right to read 1 manual, and to prove he wasn't simply going to grab and run, he laid his own stake on the table, a scripture called the Primordial Heavenly Secret, which happened to be one of the 4 lost Luguan arts, the very one his sect had walked off with the night the old school burned. You'd wager one of the 4, I said slowly, to see another of the 4. That's a strange trade, elder. Almost like you already have somewhere to be if this goes well. Curiosity, he said, is the last vice a scholar gives up, older than greed, purer. He pushed the scripture across the table. Hold it. Read the first pages. Satisfy yourself it's genuine. I am, whatever my faults, not a cheat. He let me hold it, to show good faith, to let me verify it was real. Reader, I read the whole thing in a dozen breaths and gave it back with a regretful little frown as if I found it a touch disappointing. One of the 4 great lost arts of Luguan, memorized cover to cover while I pretended to squint at the binding. Sometimes the universe hands you a thing, and the only correct response is to keep your face very still and say thank you. Then I declined to fight him personally, because I had a strict policy, and I pointed at Wen Qing instead. Challenge my disciple, I said. If you can beat my first student, we'll talk about the rest of the library. Zheng Wuji looked at the bearded man who caught fish for fun and felt, I think, genuinely insulted. Then they crossed hands, exactly once, and the great land immortal Zheng Wuji went staggering back with his whole worldview rearranged, because Wen Qing, my fish catcher, the man who'd wanted only to be free, had quietly become a land immortal himself, and a fresh sharp one at that, against an old decayed peak. 1 exchange. That was all it took. Zheng Wuji did not get to read the Origin Green Lotus scripture. What he got was the dawning horror of a scholar who has just realized that the leaking little mountain temple he came to fleece is a den holding not one, but two land immortals, and possibly worse, and that he should leave before he found out which. He left. He went off toward the far south nursing his dignity, and Wen Qing offered to chase him down and silence him, worried he'd spread word of the manual. I said no, let him talk. He and I had each walked away holding one of the other's secrets now, his stolen scripture in my head, and mine in his, and two people holding each other's secrets is the most stable peace treaty ever invented. Besides, I told my disciples, the old legend that gathering all four Luguan arts lets you ascend to immortality in broad daylight is nonsense. I would know. I was gathering them, and I was doing my ascending the hard way, 1 century at a time. Then the wind brought news from the capital, and the news was that a man named Du Lei had raised a rebellion against the young king, and that the young king's name was still Liu Yang, and that the boy I'd pulled off that road was now grown enough to have enemies inside his own palace. So I sent Wen Qing down the mountain again, quietly, to put a thumb on the scale, not to be seen, just to make sure the boy from the road got to keep being the fate of the nation. I'd been watching the boy grow up through my starry eyes for years by then, the way you'd watch a plant you weren't allowed to tell anyone you'd planted. Liu Yang had turned out hard and brilliant and desperately alone, a young king boxed in by his own mother and her lover Du Lei on one side and the merchant He Yun on the other, trusting no one, which is the correct instinct for a Qin king and a miserable way to be 16. He had found in the dusty royal archives an old sword scripture his family had kept for generations without ever cracking, and he had been teaching himself from it in secret. It was, of course, the myriad heaven sword canon, one of my 4 Luguan arts, sitting in the Qin vaults the whole time. The world is smaller than it pretends to be, and more than any of that, the boy was obsessed with a mystery. Twice now, he was certain, a sword out of nowhere had saved his life, a flash of azure light with no hand behind it, and he had decided it came from some hidden immortal on Taiyi Mountain, and he wanted, with the whole force of his lonely, furious heart, to find that immortal. He was half right. There was an immortal watching over him. He just had the mountain wrong. He needed the sword sooner than he knew. Du Lei, cornered by the boy's coming of age, sent an assassin into the palace at night, a master of the myriad realm level, a killer good enough to end a young king before the young king finished waking up. The blade came down toward Liu Yang's sleeping face. The azure sword crossed the distance again and stopped it a finger's width from his eyes. He woke to a dead assassin folding to the floor and a single blade of blue light turning in the dark above his bed, the same light from the road when he was a boy, and I felt his heart nearly stop and then flood with something enormous, terror and wonder and a wild, lonely gratitude all at once. Then the light was gone, and I drew my sword home across the miles, and a scared, brilliant young king sat alone in the dark, more certain than ever that somewhere out there, someone had decided he was worth saving. He was right. His grandfather's brother's son had decided it, 10 lifetimes deep and 100 miles away, and would never once tell him so. Some love is better delivered anonymously. It asks for nothing back that way. In the wreckage of that night, a young eunuch named Lin Qi got himself appointed master of the Central Chariot Bureau, the same spy office my brother Gao Yuan had once drowned trying to hold. I noted the name and the smooth ambition behind it and filed it under later. Everything is under later when you have my lifespan. The trouble is that later always, eventually, becomes now. Du Lei did not leave to chance. When his rebellion moved to depose the king outright, I sent Wen Qing with the 7 swords, and the 7 swords ended Du Lei and his rising in a single night, and the man died gasping a name he'd only half seen in the dark, heaven and earth, 7 swords, as if the sky itself had audited him, which, from where he was standing, it more or less had. After that, the boy's chains came off fast. He Yun fell and took his own life rather than wait for the axe, and just like that, Liu Yang held the whole of Qin in his own 2 hands at last. No regents, no rivals, nothing between him and the empire he was born to build, which meant it was finally time to give him the tools I'd been keeping for him. I was 70 now, and I made a decision I'd been circling for decades. I called Wang Hu in from his long retirement and Wen Qing back from his errands, and I told them both to go down the mountain and serve the young king's war, openly this time, all the way to the end of it. It was the thing Wang Hu had wanted his entire life, to be the sword that carved the one empire out of the 7, and I had kept him home and safe and small for years because I loved him and feared for him. And now I looked at my gray brother and understood that keeping a sword in a drawer forever is its own kind of cruelty. So I let him go to his war. The system, as if in agreement, handed me a scripture that could split off a living clone of myself, and another one so vast it could only be cultivated after ascension, and I understood the message. The road went higher than I'd let myself imagine, but first, the world down here had an empire to finish being born. My brother and my first disciple went down the mountain toward the unification of all China. And I stayed up on my peak with my animals and my new students and my 4 stolen manuals, and I got ready, in my own quiet way, to become something the world did not yet have a word for. I had 30 years left. It turned out to be exactly enough, and not 1 hour more. My temple was full now, full the way I'd once stood in the snow and prayed it might be again. 15 students had become a proper school, with sword-carrying kids everywhere, and my senior siblings grown into elders who ran the place. There was a gentle girl among them named Xuanyue, my 3rd real disciple, and she could not hold a sword, not wouldn't, couldn't. Her hands shook and her eyes went far away, because a swordsman had once ridden into her village and left nothing standing, and to her a blade was not a tool or an art, it was the specific shape of the worst day of her life. Most masters would have called that a defect and drilled it out of her. I did the opposite. I went into my collection and I brought out the kindest sword I owned, an ancient blade named Jianghu, the one the old stories call the benevolent sword, the one that legend swears will simply refuse to serve a cruel hand and dulls itself against an unjust cause. I put it in her trembling grip, sheathed, and I closed her fingers around it. This one won't let itself be used the way that man used his, I told her. It can't. It's the opposite kind of sword. Carry it not to cut, but so that the next time a swordsman rides into a village, there's someone standing in the road who a good sword chose. You don't have to become the thing that hurt you. You get to become the thing that would have stopped it, she cried. She carried it. Years later, she'd draw it in exactly that road, for exactly that reason, and it would not dull once. Because sometimes the way you heal a person is to put the very thing that frightens them into their palm and let it be gentle with them until they believe gentleness can hold an edge. Mu Yan meanwhile got a cold, cruel, beautiful blade called Soul Frost, which suited exactly where she still was. You match the sword to the wound. That's most of teaching, honestly. The rest is just waiting for the student to catch up to the sword. And every few nights, in secret, I taught the most powerful young man in the world. I'd kept walking into Liu Yang's dreams. For 5 years, I stood in his sleeping mind as a faceless master out of the 9 heavens and taught him a sword technique 1 form at a time, the 9 swords, because he was hungry for it and because a king who can defend himself is a king harder to murder. The lessons were, I'll be honest, some of the strangest hours of my life, and I've had a lot of hours. I'd build a mountaintop out of his own sleeping mind, moonlight and cloud, and I'd stand there with my back to him and drill him on a form until he got it right, and he took to it with a ferocity that told me everything about how alone the boy really was. In his waking life, Liu Yang trusted no one and could afford to trust no one. In his dreams, one old faceless voice told him he was worth teaching, and he clung to it like a drowning man. Again, I'd say, I have it, master. You have it slow. A slow, correct sword is a corpse with good posture. Again. When will you show me your face? When you can beat me. Form 4. Again. He never could beat me, obviously, and he never stopped trying, and he never once suspected that his mysterious celestial master, this immortal out of the 9 heavens who'd chosen him and him alone, was a monk on a mountain a few days' ride from his own palace, an uncle he'd never met, teaching him swordplay after bedtime like a very strange grandfather. The most terrifying man of the age, taking secret night lessons and treasuring them like a starved child treasures bread, and me on the other end of them, keeping my back turned and my voice stern so he'd never hear how much it cost me not to just turn around and say, I've got you, I've had you since the road, you were never as alone as you thought. You take your warmth where you can get it in this line of work, even when the only way to give it is disguised as a god who withholds it on purpose so the boy keeps growing. Then the lake gave birth to a person. It happened at Tongling Lake up on the mountain, a sudden pillar of purple light roaring straight into the sky, so much of it that a neighboring outfit called the Taiyi sect sent people over to see what treasure I'd unearthed. It wasn't a treasure, it was a boy. Decades before, the system had given me the 9 heavens divine jades, spirit stones potent enough to grow themselves a body if you fed them long enough, and one of them, the purple jade king, had finally finished the job. He came up out of the lake, stark naked, freshly minted, already at the heavenly human realm, with the raw strength to fight a land immortal, and his very first act as a living being was to attack me, which, honestly, fair. I subdued him with about as much effort as folding a letter, marked his brow with a little plum blossom sigil so he'd remember whose he was, and gave him a name, Xuantian, my 5th true disciple. A person made of jade and lake light who was a few minutes old and already spectacularly powerful and completely convinced he ran the place. He and Luna did not get along. 2 monarchs, 1 mountain. I raised him fast, because I could feel I was going to need him. And soon enough, the mountain came calling for exactly the kind of trouble he was built for. Zheng Wuji came back. The old scholar I'd sent packing years before had spent the interval making a friend, and the friend was Gao Xian, the moon worship cult's left envoy grown into its master, the flowery ex-Confucian who had murdered Mu Yan's mother, and the two of them arrived at the foot of my mountain with 5 grand elders at their backs, all of them come for my 4 Luguan manuals, all of them certain that a temple which had once fielded 2 land immortals could be overwhelmed by 7 cultivators if they simply brought enough of them. Mu Yan felt her mother's killer at the foot of the mountain and went down it like a falling star. I let her go, and I sent Xuan Tian and Xuan Yue down behind her, because a revenge you take yourself heals something a revenge taken for you never quite reaches, and I wanted her to swing first. She swung. Down at the foot, Gao Xian tried the honeyed voice first, all velvet, inviting the orphan to come home to the cult, to forgive, to be reasonable. And Mu Yan answered him with soul frost and a killing domain that drank the warmth out of the very air, years of grief sharpened to an edge. And Gao Xian, a 5th grade land immortal, brushed it all aside like a man waving off smoke because the gap in cultivation was simply too wide, and for one ugly moment it looked like the child was going to lose to her mother's murderer all over again. That was when Xuan Tian stepped in, my jade-born son, a palm of pure purple divine power that knocked Gao Xian clean off the ground and carried the fight up into the sky. The watching Taiyi sect elder, an old land immortal named Jade Rivermaster who'd come to gawk, nearly swallowed his own beard because White Cloud Temple had apparently produced yet another absurd young monster. The two of them tore across the heavens, purple against the moon worship art, and it was close, and it was loud, and it was, from my seat at the top of the mountain, never actually in doubt, because I was watching the whole time. And when Gao Xian finally gathered himself to end my student for good, I reached down from my peak across all that distance, and I closed a hand over him. Not my real hand. A hand of condensed power the size of a hillside, an enormous phantom fist that simply materialized out of the sky above the mother killer and came down. Gao Xian looked up, and for one instant this smooth, murderous, elegant man understood that he had never once been the largest thing on this battlefield, that there was a mountain behind the mountain, and then the hand closed and he dropped out of the sky like a stone with the life mostly crushed out of him. Jade Rivermaster went absolutely silent. Zheng Wuji, watching his friend fall out of a clear sky swatted by an arm no one could see the owner of, made the wisest decision of his long scholarly life, which was to conclude that this temple hid horrors he did not want itemized, and to begin, very calmly, to leave. Mu Yan's revenge was paid, not entirely by her hand, but her mother's killer fell out of the sky in front of her, and I have found that counts for more of the healing than people expect. The dying, though, is where the story got bigger than my mountain, because Gao Xian had a secret in his robe, and secrets have a way of pointing at larger secrets. One of his surviving elders, a man called Stone Bear, grabbed the broken body and fled, and later read the scroll hidden in it, and the scroll said something that reframed my whole quiet corner of the world. Gao Xian's own master, a man named Gu Hong, was alive, and Gu Hong lived far away in Yuan Prefecture, in something called the Xuantian Divine Fire Cult, in a place called the Moyuan Divine Dynasty, which is to say, there was a whole wider world, out past the borders of everything I'd been treating as everything. My warring states, my great Qin, my 7 kingdoms, all of it was one province of 9. I had been the biggest fish in a pond, and had just been shown the ocean the pond drained into. I filed that away too, under a much heavier later. As for Gao Xian himself, I caught his soul before it could scatter, wiped it clean of every memory, and planted it into a stalk of enlightened bamboo to slowly grow a harmless little bamboo spirit. The moon worship cult's terrible master, reincarnated as garden furniture. Luna thought this was the funniest thing that had ever happened and brought it up constantly. Then the presents kept coming, and one of them mattered more than I knew. Among that stretch of rewards, the system handed me a blue flame, the Yu King innate true flame, it called it, the 4th of 7 fire realms, a fire that did not so much burn things as decline to let them keep existing. I turned it over in my hands and admired the color and set it carefully aside. Remember the blue flame. It comes back, very soon, and it settles an argument permanently. Around then, my 3 special students came home from the world, all grown up. Chen Feng, the plain stubborn boy the heavens forgot, had ground himself into something real through nothing but work. Mei Hua had bloomed. And Huang Tianhua burned so hot and proud that when I looked at his spirit, I saw again that same old shape, a sword that would rather snap than bow. I sent all 3 back out into the wide world instead of into any army, because I had a feeling the wide world was about to matter, and I wanted my own people out in it. I did not yet know what that decision was going to cost one of them. I turned 80. The phoenix egg finally, after all those patient years, hatched. It produced, I regret to report, the single ugliest bird I have seen in 10 lifetimes. A bald, scrawny, gawky gray thing that looked less like a mythical firebird and more like something the mythical firebird had thrown out. We named it Shadow. Luna was deeply, publicly disappointed, having guarded that egg for decades expecting to midwife a god and instead getting what looked like a plucked complaint. Shadow would grow into its legend eventually. Most ugly things do, if you feed them and don't say the quiet part out loud. And then Wenqing came up the mountain with the news I had been waiting 50 years to hear, and it landed heavier than I expected. The state of Zhao had fallen. My brother Wang Hu and my disciple Hao Ming had led the armies that broke it, the last great obstacle gone, its finest general framed and destroyed by a bribed traitor from the inside, its capital taken, and the king of Qin, my grandnephew Liu Yang, had walked into the city of his miserable hostage childhood and settled every old score he'd carried since he was a boy on that bad road. And in the taking of it, the Zhao sword sect, the sect whose master Han Jihai had killed our teacher, the sect that had ambushed and slaughtered 6 of my brothers in a single afternoon a lifetime ago, was wiped from the earth down to the last stone. I went and sat at master's grave for a while, with the wind in the pines, and I told him the last part, Han Jihai, decades ago, and now the sect itself, and the whole state that sheltered it, gone. The revenge you died asking me to be patient about is finished, all of it, every name. You can rest the whole way down now. I don't know if the dead hear us. I've never been able to find out, in any of my lives, which is its own kind of answer. But I said it anyway, because some things you say for the living person still standing at the grave. The rest of the news rode in on the same wind. The state of Yan, terrified and next in line, had sent the head of its own crown prince to Qin to beg for peace, which is the kind of thing that only ever means a knife is coming behind it. I walked into Liu Yang's dreams that night and warned my grandnephew that the peace envoy from Yan would carry death in its luggage. History remembers the assassin's name and the map he hid the dagger in. My grandnephew remembers a dream master who warned him in time. Both of those are true. He lived, is the point, and he begged his celestial teacher to finally teach him the sword control art, and I told him he'd have it and more once he'd finished the canon. I always kept a little something back. It's how you keep a king coming to his lessons. And it cost me, the way I'd half felt it would when I sent those 3 bright children into the wide world. Mei Hua and Chen Feng came back to me married, which was a joy, and carrying a baby who was slowly dying, which was not. Their infant son, Chen Bo, had been poisoned in the womb by something out in that wider world, and he'd have died in his first month except for a freak of his own body that had kept the poison from his heart. I took the child and I rebuilt him from the blood out, gave him a body poison would never touch again, and kept him on the mountain as my own live-in student. That part had a happy ending. The other part didn't. Huang Tianhua, the proud one, the sword that would rather snap than bow, was not with them. He'd crossed a creature of the xianxia sect out at the edge of the sea, a battle he could not win, and rather than be taken, he had thrown himself off the world's edge into the deep water and vanished, gone. My fierce boy, swallowed by an ocean I'd never even seen. I sent his grieving friends off to that far sect to learn what they could, and I sat with the particular guilt of a teacher who sends a student toward the thing that kills him, and I did not yet know, could not have known, that the sea does not always keep what it takes, and that this was not the ending of Huang Tianhua's story, but the strange, cold beginning of a much larger one. That, too, is a thread for the next telling. I seem to be leaving you a great many of those. It's the trouble with 1,000-year life. Every ending is somebody else's beginning, and they all keep going after the part where I stop talking. And through all of it, quietly, I kept climbing. I found a new sword intent in a waterfall, the way you find things when you've been looking at the same water for 80 years. I fed the blue flame. The system handed me 12 enormous puppet guardians, and I set them to digging a whole city under the mountain, because immortals need hobbies. And somewhere in there, at 85, I crossed into a realm the world below did not even have a name for, the Gate of Death, the second-to-last threshold before the thing I'd been walking 1,000 years to reach. One gate left. The Gate of Life, and on the far side of it, after 10 lifetimes, the immortality the system had promised a dead corporate slave 1,000 years ago. I could feel it up ahead of me now, close, like a door with light under it. I had 15 years left to reach it. What I did not know was that before that door, the wide world I'd just learned about was going to send its first true monster to my mountain, and that the whole thing was going to come down to a blue flame and 3 breaths. But first, the thing I had promised a dying king I would protect finally finished being born. When I was 86, the last of the 6 kingdoms fell, and Liu Yang, the frightened boy I'd pulled off a bad road with a flying sword, stood at the center of a single unified realm for the first time in 500 years and gave himself a new title because king was no longer big enough for what he was. First Emperor, Qin Shi Huang. My brother Wang Hu and my disciple Hao Ming had carved the road to it with their own hands, the god of death and the orphan I'd named Peace, and the two of them had done between them what no generals in history had done, and my mute grandnephew's dream master had quietly kept him alive at every step of the way. 500 years of grinding war, the wars that had eaten Wen Qing's sleep and buried 400,000 men, and orphaned Mu Yan and Xuan Yue and every other broken child who'd ever climbed my mountain. Finally ended. One hand had closed over all of it, exactly as I'd told a dying king it someday would. Wang Hu came home for it. My brother, past 90 now, the god of death with his war finally, permanently over, walked back up my mountain one last time under his own power. We sat where we always sat, and we played Go under the lamp, the two lonely boys from the scripture library, one of them the man whose armies had ended an age of war, and one of them the man who'd quietly kept the whole thing pointed the right way, and neither of us said much, because we never had to. At the end of the game, he set down his last stone and said, "We did it, junior brother, the thing nobody thought could be done. It's one country now. The children won't grow up in the war we did." And then this old grim engine of a man, who had buried more human beings than anyone alive, put his face in his hands at my tea table and wept, not for the dead, I think, but from the sheer unbearable relief of setting down a thing he'd been carrying since he was a boy at the window. I let him. Some tears you don't undercut with a single word. You just refill the tea and sit with your brother while the war finally leaves his body. I let myself feel that for about a day. Then the wide world knocked, and it knocked hard. His name was Gu Hong, and he was the first person to walk up to my mountain in this entire lifetime who was genuinely, on paper, my equal. A full 9th grade land immortal, one of the 3 great sword immortals of the whole region, more than 150 years old. He was the true master behind the moon worship cult, the man whose student Gao Xian I'd swatted out of the sky, and he had come for my 4 Lugan manuals because he already held one, the divine will natural technique he'd stolen as a boy, and he believed the old legend that all 4 together opened the door to immortality in a single afternoon. And there was something older tangled in it too. His father had been a man named Gu Yuan, and when I heard that name 1,000 years of memory turned over because I had fought a Gu Yuan once, in a life so far back it was almost someone else's. The wide world, it turned out, had been circling my mountain for longer than my mountain knew. He came with his sister Li Hanyue and the fugitive Stone Bear, and my jade-born son Xuan Tian went down to meet him because I was curious to see how my newest monster measured against a real one. Gu Hong answered that question by unsheathing the sky. He unleashed a technique called the 10,000 Swords Homage, and every blade within 100 miles tore itself loose and turned toward my mountain. Tens of thousands of swords, including the entire arsenal of the Watching Tai sect, a screaming steel storm called up out of the whole countryside to bury us. It was, I will admit, genuinely impressive. It was the most dangerous single thing anyone had aimed at White Cloud Mountain in 80 years. I froze it. From my seat at the top of the mountain, I reached out and simply told my own swords, and the temple's swords, and the air itself, to be still, and the near half of that steel storm locked in place mid-flight. And down at the foot, Xuan Tian stood into the rest of it and manifested the 3 great sword intents, heaven and earth and man, purple light against the swordfall, and held, but not quite enough. Because Gu Hong was 150 years of real cultivation, and my son was a few years old, and when the sword immortal saw he couldn't break the boy fast enough, he did the thing the great ones do. He turned his own body into a sword, his whole being, into one final unstoppable thrust aimed straight through Xuan Tian's heart, and I lit the blue flame. Remember the blue flame. The Yu King innate true flame crossed the distance between my hand and my son faster than a sword immortal's killing lunge, and it caught Gu Hong in mid-strike, and it did not fight him. It simply, quietly, declined to let him keep existing. 3 breaths. That was all it took. One of the 3 great sword immortals of the region, a full 9th grade land immortal, 150 years old, come to peel my mountain open, gone in 3 breaths of a fire the color of a clear winter sky. His sister and Stone Bear took one look at a blue flame eating an immortal and fled for their lives, and I let them go, because terror travels faster than any messenger, and I wanted the wide world to hear exactly what it had sent its monster into. Xuan Tian came back up the mountain pale and quiet and told me, honestly, that he'd have died down there without me. I told him that knowing the exact size of the gap between you and the thing that almost killed you is the most valuable lesson a young immortal ever gets, and to sit with it and to grow. I'd caught Gu Hong's soul before it scattered, the way I'd caught his students, and the soul of the great sword immortal, finally understanding that the humble abbot in front of him was not a land immortal at all, but something the wide world had no name for, stopped scheming and started bargaining. He gave me the last thing I needed. The divine will natural technique, the 4th and final Luguan art, the one my master Guangli had wanted his whole life and died without seeing whole. After 1,000 years and one long-dead teacher's dying wish, all 4 were finally, quietly mine. And then Guhong's soul gave me one more thing, and this one I did not see coming, and it is the reason I am not entirely made of stone even now. His father Gu Yuan had left behind a scroll. The Thousand Illusions Scroll, a map pointing back toward a figure 800 years gone, the Thousand Illusions Martial Emperor, a woman named Ye Mingyu, and when I unrolled it and understood what it pointed at, 10 lifetimes of careful, ironic, hard-won distance went very thin, because a long time ago, in my second life, before Qin and before the mountain, and before I ever learned to keep my face this still, there had been someone, and we had made each other a promise, the specific impossible kind you only make when you're young enough to believe the universe takes requests. Find me again. Across the lives, across the deaths, however far the wheel turns, find me. 10 lives, 1,000 years, 9 deaths and 9 resets and 168 birthday gifts and an empire raised and a teacher avenged and a gate of death crossed, and in all of it, through all of it, I had never once found her. The scroll in my hands was the first thread I'd held in 1,000 years that might someday lead back to her. I stood there with it for a long time, on a mountain full of people I loved, the strongest man for 1,000 miles in any direction, and I let myself feel the one thing I never let anyone see. Not loneliness, exactly. Something older than loneliness. The particular ache of a promise you have kept faith with for so long that keeping faith has become the only shape your heart still remembers how to make. Then I rolled the scroll back up, and I put it away, and I went back to becoming a god, because that was the errand in front of me, and the other thing would have to wait a little longer. It had already waited 1,000 years. What was a little longer between the two of us? My grandnephew, meanwhile, had gotten ambitious in the specific way that only a man who has already conquered everything he can see can get. Liu Yang, first emperor of a unified realm, had learned what I'd learned, that his empire was one province of 9, and he had decided, of course he had, that he would unify all 9, the way the ancient sage kings were said to have done. And in his dreams he knelt to his celestial master and begged me for the real prize, the immortality, the Tao itself. I told him a story about fishing instead of answering, the way you do with someone who wants a thing before he's ready to hold it, and I promised I'd teach him the immortal Tao after he turned 80, which bought me time, but I also told him the truth, or the edge of it. Above the human world, I said, there is heaven, and there are people in heaven, and not all of them wish the world below to be whole. Some of them prefer it broken. He didn't understand. I barely did myself. But I had crossed 9 deaths, and I had felt, more than once, that the sky was not an empty ceiling, but a floor, with something standing on it, looking down, and not always kindly. I filed heaven itself under later, the heaviest later of all. Then, at 90, I gathered everyone, all of them, my siblings, past 100 now, and still strong on the methods I'd given them, Mei Lia and Xiao Xiaoran and Chen Mingde, my brother Wang Hu, 98, and finally at peace, Wen Qing the fish catcher, Hao Ming the orphan, jade-born Xuan Tian, cold-thawed Mu Yan, gentle Xuan Yue, a talking cat, an ugly phoenix, a monkey, a mountain full of the family I had built one funeral and one stray at a time across the loneliest lifetime of the 10. I told them I was going into seclusion for 10 years, that they were not to disturb the forest whatever they saw or heard, and that when I came out, one way or another, everything would be different. Then I sealed the forest, and I sat down, and I began the last long walk to the last door. 10 years I sat there. And out in the wide world, in a windswept place called Xianxia, my grandnephew the first emperor was dying, and I did not know it, because I was sealed away, and my dreams had gone dark for a decade, and a smiling poisoner had been feeding him fake elixirs of immortality and true poison in the same cup. The one time in 100 years, the boy from the road truly needed his celestial master. His celestial master was 1,000 miles deep inside himself, reaching for a door. I would have to carry that later too. But that is a grief for the next telling. This one still has a mountain to climb. The end, when it came riding a storm. There was a little white snake on the mountain named Snowflake. She'd shown up small and half-frozen years before, and she'd grown up around the place, coiling in the warm purple glow of Xuan Tian's qi, listening to the salons she couldn't possibly follow, dreaming the one dream every snake secretly dreams, which is to stop being a snake and become a dragon. It's an absurd, enormous, beautiful ambition, and the odds against it are roughly the odds against a raindrop deciding to become the sea. I had a soft spot for her. I have always had a soft spot for small things that want to be more than they were born as. It's the whole story of my life, in scales. She chose that decade to try. She called down her transformation tribulation, the heavenly lightning that either makes a dragon or makes ash, and she was not ready, and she was too small, and she failed, and she fell out of the sky burning. and watching her fall, watching the heavenly thunder come down to punish something for the crime of trying to become more than it was born as, something in me that had been waiting 1,000 years finally, fully understood the last door. So I stood up, and I walked out into her tribulation, and I let the lightning of heaven fall on me instead. It should have killed me. It was designed to kill things exactly like me, things reaching above their station, and it came down with the full weight of a sky that does not like to be climbed. The first bolt drove me to one knee, the second put me on both. It broke me open, gate by gate by gate, each one a door I'd spent a century learning to even find, and the thunder tore through every one of them and kept going. And there was a moment, a real one, where 1,000 years of me simply wanted to let go, because I was so tired, and the ground was right there, and 9 deaths had taught me exactly how easy dying is once you stop arguing with it. And then I thought about the mountain behind me, the family in it, the scroll in my sleeve and the promise in the scroll, and something in me that a corporate slave and 9 dead men had built, one refusal at a time, stood back up. I stopped taking the lightning and started drinking it. I turned the fire meant to end me into the last fuel I'd ever need, and somewhere in the white screaming heart of it, 99 deaths deep and 1,000 years long, I said the only prayer I have ever meant. If heaven wants to destroy me, then heaven and I are going to have a problem, because I have come too far and buried too many people to stop one door short. Tear the sky if you have to. Just do not stop. I did not stop. The last gate broke. And after 10 lives, after 1,000 years, after a corporate slave died drooling on a keyboard and woke up a screaming infant with a glowing panel in his soul, I crossed the final threshold and became the thing the system had promised at the very beginning and never once explained. A living true immortal. The blood in my veins turned to golden light. The whole mountain rang like the inside of a bell. And above me, in answer, the sky itself opened. The heavenly gate. The real one. The door out of the mortal world and up into whatever heaven actually is, swung wide, and light poured down, and every instinct a cultivator is supposed to have screamed at me to rise, to leave, to ascend, to finally step off the wheel and out of the dirt and into the company of the immortals. I looked up at the open gate of heaven, the prize at the end of 1,000 years, and I said no. I remembered the people standing on that floor above the sky, the ones who liked the world below broken. I remembered a king who died reaching for a throne he could have set down. I remembered a mountain full of family behind me, and a scroll in my sleeve pointing at a promise 1,000 years unkept, and a woman somewhere in all these turning lives still, maybe, waiting. Whatever was up through that gate, it was not that. It was not them. It was not her. So I waved the gate of heaven away, the way you'd wave off a servant offering a dish you didn't order, and I told it, out loud, on my own mountain, that I thought I would pass, and the light closed, and the sky healed over, and I stood there in the settling gold with the whole thing done, immortal at last, and going absolutely nowhere. The system, delighted, kept right on handing me presents, tugging me forward into something it called the immortal Tao, whispering that above the great Tao there is no ceiling, that a person could keep climbing past immortality itself toward things that don't have names yet. Fine. Later. I closed the panel. Down the mountain, my disciples and the watching Tai sect had seen the heavenly gate open over White Cloud Mountain, and they had drawn the obvious wrong conclusion. They believed I had ascended. They believed the abbot had finally left the world, risen into heaven, gone forever, the way the stories always end. So I walked back out of the forest to correct them. I want you to picture it. My whole family, gathered in grief at the edge of the sealed woods, certain they just watched me leave the mortal world for good. And then the sealed woods open, and here comes the old abbot, on his own 2 feet, alive, immortal, and visibly a little annoyed at the fuss. Xuantian's mouth fell open. Luna dropped whatever royal composure she had left. And Chen Mingde, frail no longer, my 11th brother, whispered that the gate had opened, that I could have gone, that I was supposed to have gone. I know, I told them. It was right there. Ascension to the immortal realm. The thing every cultivator in every story is supposed to want more than breathing. I looked around at all of them, my 1,000-year haul of strays and monsters and orphans and family. It was never what I wanted. I told the king of Qin the same thing 60 years ago, and he didn't believe me either. I don't want the throne. I don't want the heavens. I want this. I have always only wanted this. And that, more or less, is the story of how I spent 1,000 years and 10 lifetimes becoming the only living true immortal in the whole wide world, and then turned down heaven's open door to go back to a leaking temple full of people I loved and a cat who was furious I'd worried her. I thought, standing there in the gold light with my family staring at me, that the hard part was finally over. The sky, which had been watching the whole time, was about to inform the entire world otherwise. Because when a mortal becomes a living true immortal, apparently, heaven notices. And heaven, it turns out, keeps score. But not right away. That is the part the old stories skip, the part between the miracle and the consequences, and it turned out to be the best stretch of time I'd had in about 400 years, so let me stand in it for a moment before the world arrived to spoil it. For a while, nothing happened. I came down off the thunderhead, a living true immortal, and then I made tea, and then, for a season, I simply lived on my mountain, like a man who had finally paid off an enormous and very old debt. Do you know that feeling, the loose, strange lightness in the days after a thing you have dreaded or chased your whole life is finally, actually done? Multiply it by 1,000 years. I had spent 10 lifetimes climbing toward one door, and I had reached it, and I had looked through it, and I had shut it and turned around and gone home. And now I had nothing left to climb toward, and everyone I loved still in reach, and it was, for a little while, the closest thing to peace I have ever known. I spent a good part of it fixing a snake. You will meet her again shortly, so I will introduce her properly now. Years back, Xianxia, my jade-born disciple, had raised a white snake from an egg, an enormous, affectionate, ridiculous creature who liked to sun herself in coils the size of a granary and steal warm laundry, and on the night of my ascension, that snake had done a very brave and very stupid thing. She had tried to force her own dragon transformation to leap the whole gap from beast to dragon in one night of tribulation lightning, because she had decided if her family was going to be full of immortals, she was not going to be left behind as a pet, and she had failed. She had fallen half dead out of a burning sky, and her falling, her refusal to be small, the sheer stubborn love of it, had been the exact thing that cracked open the last locked door in my own understanding and sent me through the gate of death and out the other side. I did not ascend in spite of that snake. I ascended because of her. So the very first thing I did with my shiny new immortality was go and finish what she'd started. I coaxed her the rest of the way across the dragon gate slowly, over days, holding the transformation steady, where her own strength had given out. And she came through it at last, not quite a dragon, into a sulky, luminous, faintly scaled young woman who was outraged by the concept of clothing and kept forgetting she had feet, pouring herself across the floor to get places. She hissed at Xianxia for a week every time he blushed and looked away, which was constantly. We named her Yu Susu. She was 10 weeks old as a person and about 800 pounds of pure devotion in a body that no longer knew what to do with itself. And watching Xianxia try to teach the snake he'd raised how to be a girl he was suddenly and mortifyingly unable to look directly at was the single most entertaining thing that happened to me that entire century. That was the shape of that season. Small, warm, ridiculous things. The animals, all of them enlightened over the long years by a technique I'd been handed lifetimes ago, had turned my mountain into something between a monastery and a very opinionated town council. Luna, my black cat, self-appointed king of the mountain for 300 years running, was so close to her own human form you could see it gathering, and had grown correspondingly unbearable. Misty, the monkey I'd named on a whim decades back, had gotten it into his head that he was going to be a proper disciple with a proper sword, and had begun bowing to me formally every morning, which would have been touching if he had not also been stealing the offering fruit with his other hand while he did it. The white vultures patrolled the peaks. And the ugly bald bird that had hatched, at long last, out of the great warm egg I'd found in a fire cave years before, a creature I'd named Shadow with more honesty than kindness, had turned out to be a phoenix and spent its days being deeply embarrassed about how it currently looked and setting small accidental fires when it sulked. Misty, especially, broke my heart a little that season, in the good way. The monkey had decided he was going to be a real disciple, and he pursued it with the whole of his small, serious soul. He had found a stick roughly the shape of a sword, and he practiced with it at dawn where he thought no one could see, copying the forms he'd watched the humans learn, getting them wrong in ways so earnest I could not bring myself to correct them. He had started sitting in on my lessons at the back, brow furrowed, nodding at things he could not possibly understand. I had spent 1,000 years being asked for power by kings and cult masters and swordsmen who would have burned the world to get it, and here was a monkey who wanted to be my student so badly he'd whittled himself a sword and wanted it for no reason at all except that he loved the mountain and wanted to belong to it properly. And I tell you honestly that of all the beings who ever asked me to teach them, he was among the very few who deserved it on the spot, and there were the two who had been with me longest of all, Mei Lia and Chao Xiaoran, my sixth sister and my ninth, from the very beginning. From the terrible early days when there had been only 4 of us left alive at the foot of a fresh grave, swearing revenge we were far too weak to take. They were past 100 now, both of them, kept walking and clear-eyed by methods I'd spent lifetimes gathering, and they had been at my side for the entire 1,000-year length of it, from a leaking temple with 4 frightened survivors to a mountain heaven itself would soon be forced to acknowledge. We did not have to say much to each other anymore. We had run out of new things to say around year 600 and discovered to our surprise that this was not a loss but the whole point. Sometimes in that season, the three of us would simply sit on the terrace in the evening, the last of the original four, and the two who'd waited longest, and watch the light go down over the peaks we had defended and grown old on and never once left, and it was the kind of quiet that a younger man mistakes for nothing happening, and an old one recognizes as the reward for everything. That was the season on its warm surface, the family and the animals, and the light going down over the peaks I had never once left. But an immortal with nothing left to prove still has to fill his days somehow, and I filled mine in stranger ways than sitting on terraces. Beneath all this, under the mountain itself, I had a retirement project. A set of guardian puppets from one of my old system rewards, 12 of them, tireless and clever, had spent years quietly excavating and building until there was an entire underground palace city down in the roots of the peak, halls and forges and channels of moving water, and down in the deepest forge I had reforged my 9 divine swords into something worthy of what I'd become, casually, over a few evenings, the way another retired man might refinish a chair. I mention it not to boast, but because it is genuinely strange to become the strongest being alive and discover that mostly what it gives you is very nice quiet hobbies, and through all of it, the system kept paying out. You have to understand my relationship with the thing by now. For 1,000 years, across 10 lifetimes, the same silent panel had woken up on my birthdays to hand me a gift, and the gifts had built, one absurd civilization-ending present at a time, the being I had become. I had long ago stopped being surprised and started being wry about it, the way you get wry about a relative who only knows how to show love by mailing you things. And here's the part that made me laugh out loud. Alone, on my own terrace, that quiet season. I had done it. I had reached the top. I had proven the Tao, crossed the final gate, become the living true immortal the system had promised at the very beginning and never once explained. The story was supposed to be over, the ladder was supposed to have a roof, and the system pinged me a birthday reward anyway. It handed me, if you can believe it, a 9-leaf swordgrass, a treasure of the immortal Tao, a thing for cultivating past the 9th realm, and it did this with the bland cheer of a machine that had been given exactly one job and did not intend to stop just because I had technically finished. Above the great Tao, the panel informed me, there is no end. Cultivate until transcendence. Which is a magnificent thing for the sky to say to a man who has just spent 1,000 years climbing to what he was told was the top, only to have the ceiling quietly dissolve into another staircase. Most people, when they finish the great work of their life, at least get to sit down. I finished mine and my own cheat immediately handed me the reading list for the next one. I did not know yet how badly I would need it. I just stood there in the warm season with a fistful of immortal grass and laughed because after 1,000 years the universe had finally, on the day I won, revealed its actual sense of humor, and it turned out to be exactly as relentless as I was. And Wang Hu came home. That one mattered most, and I will not make it funny. Wang Hu, my 10th senior brother, the boy I'd studied beside in the scripture pavilion 1,000 years ago, the man who became Great Qin's living god of death and carried more weight of the dead than any soul should, had finally, at the far end of a brutal life, been allowed to lay it down. The wars were won. The 6 kingdoms were won. His protege, my rescued orphan Hao Ming, held the field now, and there was nothing left that the empire needed to grind out of the old general, and so he had come back up the mountain where he'd started, 98 years old, and finally done, to play Go with me in the evenings and lose with tremendous bad grace. We did not talk much about the past. We had both been there. Mostly we sat, 2 ancient men on a quiet peak, and let the years be gentle for once, and it was enough. It was more than either of us had ever expected to get. That was the lull. I want you to have it, the whole warm shape of it, because it did not last, and the thing that ended it started, as these things do, as a rumor. Because I had not been as invisible on the night of my ascension as I would have liked. The heavenly gate does not open quietly. It had hung over White Cloud Mountain in a pillar of impossible light, and it had been seen by my neighbors on Taiyi Mountain and by others, and seen things get talked about. At first it was just a story, a strange light over a backwater peak, the kind of thing the great holy lands of the wider world would normally not trouble to notice. But the story had a shape that would not lie down, a living ascension, a true immortal walking the earth again, the first in living memory. And slowly, over that whole warm season while I fixed my snake and lost it go, the eye of the wider world had begun, from very far away, to turn toward my little mountain and squint. Most of that world decided the rumor was nonsense, and I have already told you how confidently they decided it. But not everyone wanted it to be nonsense. Some people wanted it to be true, because a mountain that had produced a living immortal was a mountain worth robbing, and one woman in particular, a woman with a dead brother and a cold patient hatred, heard the rumor of a great light over White Cloud and did not think miracle. She thought opportunity. She thought, if that mountain is hiding something that precious, then now, while the world is still calling it a rumor, is exactly the time to go and take it apart. But heaven is a slow institution. The kind that takes a while to get its paperwork in order, and the mortal world does not wait on paperwork. So before the sky ever got around to publishing the score, the world sent a delegation up my mountain to check my numbers in person. I got the news the way I got most news in those days, which was a black cat walking across my meditation and sitting down on the part of me she had decided was most important, which was my face. Luna had spent a few hundred years being the self-declared king of the mountain, and immortality had done nothing for her humility and a great deal for her ability to be smug in complete silence. She sat on my face until I opened my eyes, and then she informed me, with the weary patience of a landlord dealing with a tenant, that there were a great many people standing at the bottom of our steps, and that they had the specific smell of people who had come a long way to be rude. She was not wrong. She was rarely wrong about rude. I went out to the front terrace and looked down, and for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, the foot of White Cloud Mountain was crowded, not with pilgrims, with a war party. Let me set the scene properly, because after 1,000 years of people climbing my steps 1 and 2 at a time to be disappointed, this was genuinely a new experience. There were perhaps 24 of them, and not one was a nobody. At the front stood a woman in white and iron gray, beautiful in the cold way a knife is beautiful, and I knew her before she said a word, because she had her brother's exact way of standing like the ground owed her an apology. Li Hanyue, sister of Gu Hong, the 150-year-old sword immortal who had come to my mountain a few years back to take my scriptures and had, instead, met the blue flame and been reduced by it to the approximate footprint of a campfire. She had sworn over what was left of him that she would come back and put my mountain in the ground. I had, honestly, forgotten. That is the thing about being the strongest man in the world that the stories never tell you. Your worst days are somebody else's whole life, and she had not spent the years idle. She had spent them shopping. Behind her was a man with no sword and the stillness of someone who did not need one, and the disciples around me went quiet when they placed him, because even up on our peaceful little mountain we had heard the name Han Ming, the sword demon, the single finest blade in all of Yuan Prefecture, a man the wider world ranked at half-step divine roaming, which is a phrase I should stop and explain because it mattered. All my long life, the top of the ladder had been the 9th realm, land immortal, the Saint Tier. The height I had reached at 37 and spent decades thinking was the roof of the world. It was not the roof. Above land immortal was a realm called divine roaming profound, and the men who stood at its threshold, half a step below it, were the true powers of the wider world I had only just learned existed. Han Ming was one of them. On paper, he was stronger than anyone who had ever climbed my mountain. On paper, he was stronger than me. Standing beside him was a broad man the color of a bruise, wrapped in red, whom they called the Crimson Fiend, a 9th-rank land immortal, and a right envoy of the same Xuantian divine fire cult that had produced Gu Hong, same tier my blue flame had already eaten once. Then a married couple, Li Kong and Su Jin, who fought as one thing with 2 bodies and were reckoned together to be another half-step to the top. And a scattering of others, sect elders and grudge holders, and one enormous man named Stone Bear, who had carried Gao Xian's corpse off my mountain years ago, and clearly still had opinions about it. And at the very back, looking like a man who had been invited to a wedding he had specifically declined, was Zheng Wuji. You remember Zheng Wuji, the divine martial way's grand elder, the schemer who had come years back to win a look at my Luguan manuals with a wager, and had instead handed me one of his own to memorize before losing in a single exchange to my first disciple. He was a land immortal himself and famous, and by the look on his face he had been dragged into this alliance the way a respectable dog is dragged into a bath. He kept a careful 3 steps back from Li Hanyue and wore the expression of a man mentally drafting the letter that would explain, afterward, that he had always had reservations. It was, all told, the most dangerous single gathering of human beings that had ever stood at the bottom of my steps. If you had added up every cultivator who had ever come to White Cloud Mountain to teach the humble abbot a lesson, from Gao Yuan and his killing palm all the way down the years, you would not have gotten close to what Li Hanyue had parked at my gate. My disciples felt it. Xuan Tian, my jade-born 5th disciple, a land immortal in his own right, came and stood at my shoulder and did not bother to hide that his knuckles were white. Even old Chen Mingde, who had gone from the sickliest child in the temple to a land immortal himself and generally treated crises like weather, came out onto the terrace with his jaw set. "Master," Xuan Tian said quietly, "the one in the middle, without the sword. I do not think I can beat him." "No," I agreed. "You can't." He looked at me. "I have to tell you, one of the great small pleasures of my life was the particular face my disciples made in the exact moment they remembered who they were standing next to." Down at the foot of the steps, Li Hanyue lifted her chin and pitched her voice to carry, and what she said, in front of her borrowed army and everyone, was that she had come for the murderer of her brother and the 4 stolen Luguan manuals, and that the fraud of White Cloud Mountain could send down the so-called abbot to die, or she would come up and take the mountain apart stone by stone until she found him. And here's the part I want you to sit with, because it is the whole flavor of the thing. They did not believe in me. Not really. Word had gone around the wider world about the heavenly gate that had opened over my mountain, the impossible light, the rumor of a living ascension. And the wider world, the part with the holy lands and the half-step divine roamings, had considered this rumor and decided sensibly that it was nonsense. Zheng Wuji himself had done the math for the alliance on the way up, and I would later hear exactly how he'd framed it. A backwater temple, a monk nobody had ever heard of. He'd fought White Cloud once and found, at most, a talented young land immortal or two and some unusually good spring water. The heavenly gate was surely a trick of the light, or some sect's illusion array, or the death throes of an old man's last technique. There was no living true immortal. There had not been a living immortal walking the 9 provinces in living memory. The idea that one was hiding under a leaking roof on a nameless hill, sweeping his own steps, was the kind of thing that got you laughed out of a holy land. So they had come, 24 of the mightiest people in the world, absolutely certain they were about to bully a small-time fraud. Behind me, my mountain did not share their certainty, and for a little while before I settled it, there was something close to a war council on my front terrace. My disciples wanted to fight. That was the first thing, and it moved me, even as I told them no. Xuantian had already said his piece and set his jaw to do the impossible anyway. Old Chen Mingde, the sickly boy grown into a land immortal, was quietly counting the enemy and dividing them among us, working out who could hold the sword demon for how long while the others fell back, the arithmetic of a man who has decided to buy time with his own life and is only haggling over the price. Even Yu Susu, 10 weeks a person and barely sure of her own feet, had gone still and cold and coiled in a way that had nothing human in it, because whatever else she was learning, she had known since she was an egg that you put your body between the nest and the thing on the stairs. My children were bracing to die for me. None of them knew they were standing next to the thing the war party should have been afraid of. That is the cost of a secret kept too well. The people who love you prepare to bleed for a danger you could end with a thought, and you have to watch them be brave about it. The mountain itself was stirring too. Deep under the peak, the 12 guardian puppets in their underground city had felt the intrusion and come awake, and the old sword formations I'd seeded across the ridges a lifetime ago were humming quietly in the rock, and any one of a dozen things I had built into that hill over the centuries could have met the war party at the tree line and been enough. I had not spent 1,000 years on that mountain leaving it soft. But I did not wake any of it, not yet, because there is a difference between a mountain that can defend itself and a mountain that needs to, and I wanted, one last time, to see which one this was going to be. And then there was Wang Hu. My old brother had come out onto the terrace with the rest of us, and where the young ones saw an overwhelming enemy, the living god of death saw, out of a lifetime of habit, a battlefield. He read it the way he'd read 100 fields that decided the fate of kingdoms, his eyes going flat and professional down the line of them. The sword demon on the left, he murmured, mostly to himself. That one first, before he sets his feet. The red one is slow. The couple will not separate, so you make them choose which of the two to save, and you take the other. He had unified a continent with that voice. Then he seemed to hear himself, and he stopped, and he looked sideways at me, the small still monk beside him, who had not reached for a single one of his 100 weapons, and the old soldier let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Listen to me, he said, planning a battle. He shook his head slowly. There isn't going to be a battle, is there? There is going to be whatever you decide there is going to be, and it is going to take you about as long as deciding. I did not answer him, which was its own answer, and Wang Hu grunted and folded his arms and settled into watch. The only man on the terrace who had stopped being afraid, because he was also the only one who had known me long enough to remember exactly what the quiet meant. I stood at the top of my own steps and looked down at the largest and most dangerous misunderstanding of my very long life, and the question hanging in the cold morning air, the question my disciples were holding their breath around, the question the whole wide world would have asked if it had been watching, was a simple one. After 1,000 years of winning fights nobody knew I was in, had somebody finally brought enough to the bottom of my mountain to make it a real one? It was a good question. It deserved a good answer. And it was at exactly that moment, before I could give one, that the sky decided to answer for me. It did not do it quietly. Over the whole of the 9 provinces at once, from my little mountain to the farthest holy land, the blue went white and then gold, and the heavens tore open along a seam no one had known was there, and a list came down. I want you to understand the scale, because I have seen a great many impressive things, and this one made me set down my tea. Letters of light a full mile high, hanging over every kingdom and every ocean simultaneously, close enough to read whether you were an emperor on a throne or a farmer standing in a flooded field with a rake going slack in your hands. Every living soul in the world looked up at the same moment and saw the same thing. The peerless ranking, the older cultivators called it, when they got their voices back. Heaven's own tally, drawn perhaps once in an age, of the 12 mightiest living beings under the sky. To have your name written on it was said to be a blessing in itself, a mark of heaven's favor, a reward. And it was writing itself out slowly, deliberately, the way a judge reads a verdict, and it was counting up from the bottom. Down at my gate, the war party forgot about me entirely. You would have too. Even Li Hanyue turned her cold face up to the light like everyone else. Even the sword demon, who had not visibly reacted to anything since arriving, tilted his head a fraction. When heaven publishes the names of the 12 strongest people alive, every strong person alive privately wants to know whether they made the cut. It is the most human thing about them. The first name to burn itself solid was the 12th. Now remember, I had spent my entire long life as a frog in a very deep and comfortable well. I knew Great Qin. I knew the Jianghu of the Central Plains. I had only in these last years learned that the world I knew was one province of 9, that beyond it lay 6 great holy lands older than my dynasty and full of powers that made the sword masters of my youth look like the local talent. So when the 12th name resolved and the wider world gasped and my disciples looked blank, I was somewhere in between, a man reading the names of legends he had only just been told existed. Number 12 was a man they called the Buddha sword-immortal, though those who feared him used his other name, Heartless. Let me give him his due, because heaven did. He had been born the unwanted, illegitimate son of an old sect master of the heavenly Buddha sect in the Far Tang prefecture, a boy nobody expected anything of, and at 18 he had walked into the sect's forbidden hall of relics and awakened 18 sacred treasures that had lain silent for centuries all at once in a single night, which had never been done before and has not been done since. He became a living Buddha with a blade, and to reach the top of his cold and perfect Tao, he had done the thing that gave him his second name, cut away his own attachments one by one, love and grief and fear and want, until the story said there was nothing left in his chest to cut, and he could raise his sword against anyone and anything without his hand ever once trembling. He was the teacher and only friend of the reigning Tang emperor. Half the wider world knelt at the mention of him. The other half slept with the lamp lit. And heaven had ranked him the 12th strongest being alive, which should tell you everything about the 11 above him, and did tell it to every soul now staring at the sky, because you have to understand what this list meant to the people reading it. This was not a rumor or a bard's ranking or some sect's flattering opinion of itself. This was heaven's own hand, drawn perhaps once in an age, and to have your name on it was said to draw down a blessing, a reward, the favor of the sky itself. Emperors had spent whole reigns praying to be named on it and died unlisted. Holy lands measured their entire worth by how many of the 12 they could claim. When Heartless appeared at the 12th place, the heavenly Buddha sect of Tang Prefecture, half a world away, erupted in bells and weeping because their living Buddha had made the list, and that meant their holy land was real, was ranked, was one of the true powers of creation. That is the weight of a single name on that sky. 12 names, and whole dynasties would rise or fall on which of them they could call their own. So I watched the war party at my feet relax by a hair, and I understood exactly what was happening in their heads, because I have spent 1,000 years reading heads. If Heartless himself, a living Buddha who had cut out his own heart, was merely the 12th, then the 11 above him were the true summits of the world, the Holy Land Patriarchs and the half-step divine roamings, the names Li Hanyue had recruited and the names those names feared, and their target, the little fraud abbot of a backwater mountain, was of course nowhere on a list like this. Could not be. The sky was confirming, in letters a mile high, that they had come to the right place to bully the right nobody. The 11th name did nothing to change their minds, and it should have, because its story was a warning if any of them had been listening. Lin Lingsu, the Thunder Sword Immortal, immortal master of the xianxia Dao sect in Song Prefecture. He too had started as nothing, a starving orphan taken in by a Buddhist temple and set to sweeping its floors, and he had found, in some forgotten cave, the entire Thunder Tao of a vanished ancient, a legacy of lightning left behind by a man dead 1,000 years, and he had swallowed it whole and become a living god who called the storm down as a personal servant and a scribe. He had grown so mighty that he turned on the very faith that raised him and bent it to his own sect's glory, and he became the personal immortal master of a sitting emperor, and now here he stood, 11th in all the world, a nobody orphan sweeper who had found a dead legend's power on a quiet mountain and risen to the top of heaven's list. If even one member of that war party had heard his own doom in that sentence, they might have turned around. None of them did. That is the thing about a story that is about to happen to you. It never sounds like yours until it is. Zheng Wuji, at the back of the war party, let out a breath I could hear from the top of my steps, and I watched him lean over to murmur something to Stone Bear, and I could read his lips and his whole smug, relieved posture well enough to write the caption. See, he was saying, this is the real world. These are the real powers. Thunder immortals and living Buddhas and men whose names outrank the 12th strongest being alive, not a monk with a broom. We were right. Whatever opened the sky over this hill, it was a trick, and the list proves it, because the list is heaven's own truth, and the abbot's name is not on it. He was correct that the list was heaven's own truth. He was about to be extremely, comprehensively, publicly wrong about everything else because the list had reached the 10th name, and the 10th name was where the wider world stopped being a story I was reading and started being a story about me. The 10th name wrote itself out slowly, and it was Yu Susu. The wider world did not know that name. It scrambled. Holy lands sent people running for their records. Who was Yu Susu, who ranked above the Thunder Sword Immortal himself, above an emperor's own teacher, 10th mightiest being under all of heaven? And the list, being heaven's own truth and evidently in no hurry, spelled it out for them in the letters of light, and the letters said, in effect, the first demon in 1,000 years to shed her beast shape and take a human form, a white dragon serpent of the divine roaming threshold of White Cloud Mountain. You already know Yu Susu, the white snake, 10 weeks a girl, the one whose brave, stupid, failed leap at her own dragon gate had cracked the last door of my ascension, and who now kept forgetting she had feet. That one. A snake in living memory. And heaven had just informed all 9 provinces that she was the 10th strongest being alive, above the Thunder Sword Immortal, above an emperor's own teacher. Down at my gate, the war party made a sound. I wish I had a better word for it. A collective, involuntary sound, the sound 24 very dangerous people make when the ground they were standing on turns out to be a rug, because whatever else was unclear, this part was not. Yu Susu of White Cloud Mountain, the mountain they had come to bully, the mountain of the little fraud abbot, that mountain had, sitting somewhere in it right now, probably eating something, the 10th mightiest being in the entire world, and she was 10 weeks old, and she used to be a snake. Li Hanyui's cold face did not crack, but her eyes came back down from the sky and fixed on my steps with a new kind of attention. Zheng Wuji's mouth opened and shut, and I heard him, because I was listening for it now, begin the first of what would become a truly heroic series of rationalizations. A fluke, he was saying, low and fast. A demon that eats the right herbs on the right mountain can spike far above its understanding. Raw strength, no wisdom. The mountain has good spiritual soil, we always knew that. It grows monsters the way a rich field grows weeds. It means nothing about the abbot, it means the opposite. It means his power is borrowed from the ground he sits on. It was a good rationalization, elegant even. It lasted exactly as long as it took heaven to write the 9th name, which was Luna. I would like to be able to tell you I kept my composure. I did not. My cat. My insufferable, self-crowned, face-sitting cat, who had spent 300 years declaring herself king of the mountain to an audience of increasingly nervous woodland animals, whose ego had survived my ascension entirely unimpressed, who had that very morning walked across my meditation to complain about the weather at my gate as though the whole invasion were a personal inconvenience I had scheduled badly. That cat. A 9-lived cat demon, the list explained to the reeling world, who had over long years quietly eaten a truly criminal quantity of her master's spare pills, and, on one unforgivable occasion that I was still not over, an entire fruit off the immortal peach tree, and had thereby clawed her way to a human form and a power that heaven now ranked the 9th greatest in all creation. 2 spots, Yu Susu at 10, Luna at 9. The 10th and 9th strongest beings under the whole of heaven, and one of them had been a snake 10 weeks ago, and the other one was a cat who had gotten there by theft. Somewhere up behind me in the temple, I heard a smug meow. The war party was not making elegant sounds anymore. Whatever relief Zheng Wuji had wrung out of the 12th and 11th names was gone, because his rationalization had a flaw, and the flaw was that heaven does not fluke twice in a row into the same mountain. 1 monster is good soil, 2 is not soil, 2 is a farmer, and 2 of the 10 mightiest beings in the world had just been revealed to be, respectively, my student's pet snake and my personal cat, which raised, for anyone at the bottom of my steps with the wit to follow it, a genuinely upsetting question. If the pets ranked 9th and 10th, what in the name of every buried god ranked higher, and where did it live, and had they perhaps just brought their entire borrowed army to knock on its door? Nobody wanted to ask that question yet, so they stood, and stared, and waited for the list to keep climbing, and told themselves the numbers would surely start belonging to strangers again. The 8th name did not belong to a stranger, the 8th name belonged to a boy I had almost overlooked. His name was Chen Feng, and I have to go back a little to make you feel this one, because it is not funny, and I do not want to make it funny. Decades ago, when I finally sent my senior disciples down into the world to bring back fresh students and refill a temple that had shrunk to a handful of old friends, they came back up the mountain with 15 children. And my skills elder, Chen Mingde, who had an eye for talent the way a jeweler has an eye for stones, went down the line of them and told me quietly which ones would fly. This one has a sword bone, this one has a still heart, this one, this bright one, will outgrow us all. And then he had come to a thin, plain, ferociously serious boy at the end of the row, and he had lowered his voice, and he had said, "And this one, master, works harder than any child I have ever seen, and I am sorry to say he has the least talent of the 15. He will break his heart trying to keep up. Perhaps we should be gentle about his expectations." That was Chen Feng. The one with no gift and no ceiling anyone could find, because he never once stood still long enough to hit it. The other children learned a form in a week. He learned it in a season, and then he practiced it for 10 more seasons after they'd stopped, alone, in the dark, in the snow, with a stubbornness that frankly worried me. He married another of that class, a sharp, kind girl named Mei Hua. They had a son who was born poisoned nearly to death, and I pulled the poison and remade the boy's body, and the two of them wept and thanked me, and then, instead of settling somewhere safe with their healed child, they went back out into the worst parts of the world because one of their old classmates had gone missing and Chen Feng was not built to leave a man behind. That was the last I had heard of him in years, a worried father with a plain sword and no particular talent, walking into danger for someone else's sake because it did not occur to him not to. And heaven had just carved his name into the sky as the 8th mightiest being alive. The list, still unhurried, still merciless, told the world why. Somewhere in those years of walking the earth's rough edges, the boy who could not keep up had stumbled onto the buried inscription of a sword ancestor 500 years dead, and where 100 gifted men would have taken the shortcut it offered and burned themselves out on power they hadn't earned. Chen Feng had done what Chen Feng did with everything, which was work, slowly, completely, for years. Until the thing that talent could not give him, time and refusal had built instead, brick by patient brick, into the hegemon sword immortal, 8th in all the world. I am 10 centuries old and I have very few illusions left about myself, but I will tell you plainly, I stood on my terrace and my eyes stung, and it was not from the wind. Because every teacher tells the gifted ones they can do anything, it costs nothing, and it is usually true. But the boy I had almost let my skills elder be gentle with, the one with the least talent of 15, had climbed higher than any of the prodigies, on nothing but the one quality no reward in my whole system had ever been able to hand out. I had given my disciples miracles for 1,000 years. Chen Feng had reminded heaven and me and everyone that the oldest miracle is a person who simply will not quit. Down at my gate, nobody was rationalizing anymore. You could watch it happen if you knew what to look for. Zheng Wuji had run out of clever things to say. His mouth was a flat line. The Crimson Fiend, the 9th-rank land immortal in his bruise-colored robes, had shifted his weight backward, one step, the small, unconscious step a body takes when it starts, ahead of the mind, to consider leaving. Because the fluke theory was dead. You cannot fluke your way to 4 of the 10 strongest beings alive out of one small mountain. A pet, a prodigy, and now a boy with no gift at all of them from the same leaking temple, all of them, and heaven was not slowing down. The war party had climbed my mountain believing they were the dangerous ones. They were beginning, in the pit of the stomach where people know things before they admit them, to suspect they had climbed into something's mouth. And they still had not seen the worst of it, because the 7th name, when it came, belonged to a dead man, Huang Tianhua, and I had buried that name in my own heart years before, so when it wrote itself across heaven, I did the undignified thing and grabbed the terrace rail. He had been one of the bright ones, the very bright ones. When Chen Mingde walked that line of 15 children and said this one will outgrow us all, Huang Tianhua was the one he meant, a boy with a blade spirit like a struck bell, proud and clean and breakable in the specific way of people who would genuinely rather snap than bow. A sword that would rather break than bend, I'd said of him once, and I'd meant it as praise and a warning in the same breath, because I had lived long enough to know which of those swords come home. I sent him out into the wide Jianghu to temper that pride, and the world had done what the world does to the proud and the bright. Word had come back, after a long and terrible silence, that he had gone up against a so-called demoness of the xianxia sect, a woman named Ning Xuan, in some running battle across the eastern coast, and that at the end of it, cornered and outmatched and unwilling to be taken, my proud, unbending boy had thrown himself off a cliff into the winter sea rather than kneel. No body, no grave. Just a cold stretch of water and a silence I had folded up and carried ever since, one of the small permanent weights you accumulate when you outlive everyone. I had failed to bring that one home. I had made peace with it the way you make peace with a stone in your shoe by deciding to call it part of your foot. He was not dead. He was the 7th strongest being in the entire world, and heaven spelled out the whole outrageous story for a gasping audience of 9 provinces, and I laughed, once, wetly, because it was so exactly, insufferably him. He had not drowned. He had gone into that winter sea and kept going, west, past the edge of every map I'd ever seen, into the far frozen west of the world, and somewhere out there in the ice the unbending boy had found a legacy of cold to match his own frozen pride, and had become, of all the ridiculous things, the Western Extreme Ice Emperor, a monarch of a kingdom of snow I had not known existed, wielder of a cold that could still the sea, and the demoness he had supposedly died fighting, the terror of the xianxia sect, the woman whose name I had quietly hated for years as the last thing my boy ever faced. He had married her. Ningxuan was his empress. The two of them ruled the ice together, and by every account that reached the list, she was the only person in creation who could make the Western Extreme Ice Emperor laugh, and I stood on my mountain torn perfectly down the middle between grief turned inside out into joy, and the pure exasperated wonder of a teacher discovering that the funeral he'd been quietly holding for a decade had been, that entire time, a wedding. I had mourned a boy who was off getting married to my nightmare and building an empire out of the thing that was supposed to have killed him. If he ever came home, I was going to embrace him, and then I was going to make him explain, in front of everyone, why he could conquer the frozen West, but could not send a single letter. That was the 7th name. Number 10, a snake. Number 9, a cat. Number 8, the boy with no talent. Number 7, the boy I had already grieved. And every last one of them mine. The war party at the bottom of my mountain had gone the specific gray of people doing arithmetic they do not like, because look at what heaven was telling them, plainly, in a hand a mile high. This mountain did not merely produce power. It did not lose to it. Its snakes became dragons, its cats became queens, its untalented became hegemons, and its dead came back as emperors, 4 of the 10 mightiest beings alive, and the list was still climbing, and not one of the 4 had even been what anyone would have called the mountain's best. These were the pets and the strays and the ones who'd wandered off. Li Hanyue had brought 24 of the world's great powers to a place that turned its cast-offs into the top of heaven's own list, and somewhere above all 4 of them, still unwritten, sat whatever this mountain considered its actual strength. The sword demon, Han Ming, who had not spoken since he arrived, finally spoke. I heard it clearly. He said, to no one, in the flat voice of a professional recalculating a job, that they should perhaps have asked more questions before they came. They were about to get a great many answers, because the list had reached the 6th name, and the 6th name was a girl who had climbed my mountain once, years ago, spitting with grief, demanding the power to kill, Mu Yan, and of everyone on the list so far, she was the one who had come to me asking for exactly this. She had been a white-haired child when she stormed my steps, 7 or 8 years old and burning like a struck match, thrashing my young disciples out of her way and demanding, not asking, demanding, that I hand over the myriad heaven sword cannon so she could go and kill the man who had murdered her mother. Her mother had been a great master of the moon worship cult, and a left envoy named Gao Xian had put her in the ground to steal her seat, and the child who survived it had walked out of that grief with one single use for the rest of her life, which was to make him pay for it. Most children who say a thing like that are saying it to the size of their pain. She meant it as a plan. I took her in as my 4th true disciple, and I spent years doing the harder job under the obvious one, which was not teaching her the sword, she'd have learned that from anyone, but teaching her that a heart is not a prison unless you keep paying the guards. She was the best raw talent I had ever put a hand on. She broke a technique in 10 breaths that had taken grown land immortals a month. And years later, when Gao Xian came to my mountain at the head of his own war party, arrogant and flowery and utterly certain she had gotten her wish, more or less, though the finishing blow had been mine, one long remote strike out of a clear sky, because I was not going to gamble my grieving girl's life on a fair fight against a man 3 realms above her. She got her revenge. What I had wanted for her, quietly, was the part that came after revenge, the part where you find out whether there is anything left of you once the one thing is done. There was. Heaven had just ranked it 6th in all the world. She'd left to roam the Jianghu after that, a free woman with an empty debt book and, I'd hoped, a life to fill instead of a death to chase. And somewhere out there in the years since she had gone from the strongest child I'd ever seen to the 6th strongest being alive, and I found that I was not surprised exactly, but I was proud in the deep, quiet way you can only be proud of someone who was once made entirely of grief and chose, with your help, and then without it, to be made of something else. Down in the world, she was a name spoken with a drop of fear. Up on my terrace, she was the little girl who used to sulk when I made her pour tea slowly to learn patience. Both were true. That is what disciples are. And at the bottom of my steps, one man in the crumbling war party understood exactly what the sixth name meant, and it was worse for him than for anyone. Stone Bear, the big grieving thug who had carried Gao Xian's broken body off my mountain years ago and nursed the grudge ever since, stood there and did the arithmetic and went the color of ash. Because Gao Xian had died on this mountain reaching for these scriptures, and the girl Heaven had just crowned sixth in all creation, the one whose mother Gao Xian had murdered to steal a seat, was the reason he'd come to White Cloud in the first place all those years ago. The loose thread of the exact revenge Stone Bear was still, even now, trying to finish. He had spent years telling himself his master had died to a lucky ambush by an overmatched sect. He had just been informed by Heaven, in letters a mile high, that his master had died to the sixth mightiest being in the world before she had even finished growing up, and that she lived here, in the family he had marched up to punish, and that she was not even the strongest thing on the mountain. I watched a man's entire story about himself collapse in real time. It is not a pleasant thing to see, even in someone who came to kill you. Number 6. And beside me, at my shoulder, where he had been standing white-knuckled since the war party arrived, my fifth disciple made a small strangled noise because he had just done the math on what 6 meant for him. The fifth name wrote itself, and it was Xuantian, and I felt him flinch as his own name lit up the sky over every kingdom in the world. Now this one, I grant you, is a strange story even by the standards of my mountain, because Xuantian had not been born, not the usual way. He had come into the world as a 9 heavens divine jade, one of the treasures my system had handed me across the centuries, and one day that jade had gathered enough of my mountain's spiritual energy to crack itself open and step out as a bewildered naked young man with a plum blossom mark on his brow and the strength of a land immortal and absolutely no idea how doors worked. A stone that woke up into a person. I named him. I taught him. I watched him grow from a confused jade spirit into the disciple who now stood at my right hand and not 5 minutes ago had looked at the sword demon at the bottom of my steps and told me honestly that he did not think he could win. And here was Heaven telling the entire world that my jade-born fifth disciple, the one who thought he might lose, was the fifth mightiest being in all of creation. I want you to appreciate the geometry of the moment, because I certainly did. The war party had brought, as their sharpest weapon, the sword demon Han Ming, the finest blade of Yuan Prefecture, a half-step divine roaming, a man the wider world spoke of in hushed tones, and Han Ming's name was not on the list. Not 6th, not 10th. Not 12th, nowhere, because Heaven's tally had room for only 12, and my mountain was busy taking up the middle of it. The single most dangerous person Li Hanyue had been able to recruit did not rank in the top 12 beings alive, and the young man he had presumably been brought along to handle, the one standing casually next to the fraud abbot, was number 5. The coalition understood this. I watched them understand it. I watched the Crimson Fiend take his second backward step, and I watched 2 of the lesser elders simply turn and start down the mountain path without a word to anyone, the first desertions, and I watched Han Ming himself look up at the name of a boy who ranked above him and go very, very still. The stillness of a master swordsman realizing that the fight he was measuring was not the fight he was in. He was, I think, the only one of them who truly understood, and he understood it the way only a genuine master can, through the craft itself rather than the fear. The others were doing panic. Han Ming was doing geometry. I could see it move behind his flat eyes, the professional's reasoning, cold and exact. A mountain does not produce 6 of the 12 mightiest beings alive by luck or by soil. Talent like that is not grown, it is taught. And teaching on that scale, that consistently, across pets and prodigies and the untalented alike, meant a hand, one hand. And whoever owned a hand that could shape a snake and a beggar and a jade and a grieving child all into the top of Heaven's own list was, by simple necessity, standing somewhere above all 6 of them, unlisted so far only because the list had not reached him yet. Han Ming had come up the mountain believing he was the most dangerous blade in the valley. Standing in the cold with the names of 6 students burning over his head, the finest swordsman in Yuan Prefecture worked out, purely from the shape of the evidence, that he had walked into the garden of a gardener he could not see, and that the gardener had not yet bothered to look up from his weeding. His hand drifted to his sword hilt, and then deliberately moved away from it, the single most intelligent thing anyone in that war party did all morning. Xuantian turned to me, wide-eyed. "Master," he whispered. "I'm 5th? How am I 5th? Who is above me?" "3 of your seniors," I said, "and 1 stranger, and me." He opened his mouth to ask the obvious next question. He didn't get to, because the 4th name was already burning itself into the sky, and the 4th name landed on the war party like a dropped anvil, because unlike a snake or a cat or a jade, the 4th name was one they already knew. Everyone knew it. It was the name of the man who had conquered the world, Zhao Hao Ming. the undefeated king of Great Qin. Let me tell you how that name first came to my mountain, because the distance between the two versions of it is the whole point. Decades and decades ago, my first true disciple Wen Qing came back from avenging my master, carrying in one hand a box with the head of a sword saint in it, and holding by the other hand a starving child. He'd found the boy half dead in a ditch on the road, a war orphan, all knees and enormous eyes, and something about the set of the child's bones had stopped him, because Wen Qing, for all his gruffness, could no more leave astray than Chen Feng could. He brought the boy up my mountain the way you'd bring home a promising stone, half apology and half hope, and he set him down in front of me, this trembling scrap of a thing, and said, "Master, I think there's a sword in here somewhere. If you feed him first." We fed him first. I named him Hao Ming, which means safe and peaceful, because it was the thing he had never once been, and the thing I wanted him to have. He turned out to have a sword bone like the spine of a mountain, and a stillness under the fear that you cannot teach, and he became my second true disciple. And when he had grown enough, I did the hardest thing a teacher does, which is give a good soul to a hard purpose. I sent him down into Great Qin's army, identity hidden, to serve the young king who would one day try to make the endless slaughter of the warring kingdoms stop by winning it, once, completely, forever. And the world knew what came after, though the world did not know it was watching my disciple do it. The undefeated king, the general who never lost a field. You have to understand what the world had been before he walked into it. 500 years of war. Not a war, 500 years of it, 7 kingdoms grinding against one another for 24 generations, so long that no one alive had ever seen peace or believed in it, so long that the war had stopped being an event and become simply the weather, the thing that took your sons the way winter takes the old. Whole philosophies had been written to explain why the slaughter could never end, and into the last and worst of it walked a boy I had pulled out of a ditch and named Safe, carrying a sword and a stillness, and he and my old brother Wang Hu between them did the thing the philosophers had proven impossible. They ended it. Not with a massacre, whatever else you have heard, and not quickly, but completely. Han first, then Zhao, then Yan, then Wei, then vast old Chu, and finally Qi, the 6 kingdoms falling one after another over 10 hard years, each a campaign the histories would study for 1,000 years after, and at the end of it, a continent that had bled for 5 centuries lay quiet under a single sky for the first time in living memory, and the young king of Qin sat on the first throne that had ever held all the lands at once. Hao Ming had carried the worst of that on his own back, and I knew it because I knew him. Wang Hu had taught him war, and then, being Wang Hu, had taught him the cost of it, and the boy who once flinched at a raised hand had grown into a man who could order armies across rivers and still could not sleep the night after a city fell, who ended the age of slaughter precisely because he had never once learned to enjoy it. That is the general you want, if you are unlucky enough to need one. The one who wins every field and hates every one of them. Every emperor watching that list, every holy land, every peasant standing in one of those newly quiet fields with a plow instead of a spear, knew the undefeated king. He was history itself. He was the man who had stopped the war that all the wise men had proven could never be stopped. And he was the skinny orphan Wen Qing had pulled out of a ditch and I had named Safe, and heaven ranked him the 4th mightiest being alive, a divine roaming powerhouse, and he was still, in my head, and I suspect always, the child with the enormous eyes who had flinched at a raised hand for the first year, and then, slowly, over a decade of being fed first, stopped. That was the moment the war party broke. Not fled, not yet, but broke, the way a bone breaks before the skin does, on the inside, quietly, decisively, because everything before this they could tell themselves was Jianghu, was cult business, was strange mountains and stranger creatures, a world of legends that did not quite touch the real one. But the undefeated king was not a legend. The undefeated king had armies that had blackened the horizon. The undefeated king had unmade half the thrones these people paid taxes to. He was the hardest, most concrete fact in the entire world, the man who had reshaped the map with his own hands. And he was number 4, and he had learned to hold a sword on the mountain they were currently standing at the foot of, planning to sack. I heard Zheng Wuji, at last, say the thing out loud, just one word, to himself, in a voice with the bottom gone out of it. Impossible. And then, a beat later, a second word, which was the first honest thing he'd said since he arrived. Run. But you do not simply turn and run from a mountain like mine with any dignity, and these were proud people, and pride is the last thing to leave, always, long after sense has packed its bags. So they stayed rooted one more moment, staring up at the sky, at the impossible 4th name, and they waited to see the 3rd, praying it would be a stranger, praying the top of heaven's own list would finally, mercifully, belong to someone, anyone who did not do their laundry on White Cloud Mountain. The 3rd name was my first disciple. The third name was the bearded fool who once spent a freezing month catching fish out of my stream with his bare hands because I told him to. Rongxuanzi, which is a lofty Dao name meaning something like the free and unfettered one, and which I had given, with a straight face and a great deal of private enjoyment, to a man whose actual introduction to my mountain had been trying to murder one of my disciples, because that is how Wenqing arrived all those centuries ago, not as a stray, not as a child. He came up my mountain, a grown and famous man, the finest swordsman in all of Guanzhong, a celestial phenomenon master at the height of his powers, and he came to plant his flag and found a rival sect on my hill, and he very nearly ran my sickly senior disciple through the heart to do it. I came down out of the sky and caught his sword between 2 fingers and made him kneel with nothing but the weight of what I was, and this proud accomplished killer, kneeling in the snow, did the single thing that changed his whole fate. Instead of hating me, he asked to learn from me. He wanted, he said, the thing he'd spent his whole violent life being too strong to find, a free and carefree life, an unfettered way. So I gave him a test. I told the greatest swordsman in Guanzhong to go and catch 30 silverfish a day out of my frozen stream for 1 month using his hands, without a single wisp of his enormous cultivation. And he did it. That was the moment I knew. A lesser proud man would have scoffed and left. Wenqing, first hero of Guanzhong, knelt by a freezing creek every dawn for 30 days with his sleeves rolled up and his dignity in his pocket, chasing minnows, because he had finally met something worth being humble for. He became my first true disciple. Everything my mountain became, every disciple who came after, every name now burning on that list, all of it grew from the day that particular arrogant man decided he would rather learn than win. And now heaven ranked him the third mightiest being in all creation, a divine roaming immortal. Over the long centuries he had gone from my first student to my right hand to the quiet architect of half of Great Qin's rise, the man who'd run a web of eyes and whispers across the whole continent so that Hao Ming's armies always knew where to march. Third in all the world, my free and unfettered one, and I remembered him with his sleeves wet and 30 tiny fish in a bucket, grinning up at me like he'd won an empire, which it turns out he eventually would. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 8 of the 10 mightiest beings alive, and now 8 of heaven's top 12, and every single one of them mine. My snake, my cat, my hardest worker, my grieved for dead, my grief-forged girl, my waking stone, my rescued orphan, my humbled hero, a family. Heaven had opened the sky over the whole world to announce, in letters a mile high, that the most concentrated collection of raw power in all of creation lived together on one small leaking mountain and called each other brother and sister. And at the bottom of that mountain, the war party that had come to sack it finally completely broke. Zheng Wuji went first, and he did not pretend otherwise. It was, in its way, the perfect end to a very long comedy. Because of everyone at the bottom of my steps, he was the one who had wanted the Lugan manuals the most and the longest. He had come to my mountain years ago to con a look at them. He had come back this time in a war party to take them. He had spent the entire morning being the Alliance's designated optimist, whispering fluke and soil and coincidence, and it means nothing about the abbot to anyone who would listen. Doing the intellectual labor of talking 24 killers into staying, one reasonable-sounding lie at a time. And now heaven had spent an hour dismantling every single one of those reasonable lies in front of him, in order, in letters a mile high, and the old schemer's face had gone through the whole journey from smug to uneasy to gray to the particular blank calm of a man who has stopped calculating gains and started calculating exits. He turned to Li Hanyue and he said loudly, so there would be witnesses, so it would be on the record for whatever came after, that he had been misled about the nature of this place, that his divine martial way wanted no quarrel with a mountain that heaven itself had just crowned 8 times over, and that he was leaving now on foot, slowly, so that nothing at the top of those stairs would mistake his movement for an attack. A man who had schemed after my scriptures for the better part of a lifetime, walking backward down my mountain with his empty hands held carefully where I could see them. I could not have designed him a more fitting departure if I had scripted it, and believe me, over 1,000 years, I had learned to appreciate a well-shaped exit. And then his own disciple, the cloth sword boy Ling Tao, who had come up the mountain years ago at his side, did something that made the old schemer stop dead. The boy bowed, not to Zheng Wuji, to me, up at the top of the steps, a full deep bow, and he called up through the cold air that if White Cloud Mountain would have him, he would rather sweep its steps than be first disciple anywhere else in the world. And he walked away from his own master and stood at the foot of my stairs with his head down, waiting. I have never in my life collected a disciple more easily. I did not even have to make him catch a fish. The Crimson Fiend left without speaking. The couple, Li Kang and Su Jin, left holding hands and walking fast. Stone Bear, the big man who'd carried Gao Xian's body off my mountain and nursed his grudge for years, looked up at a sky with 8 of my children in it and made, at last, the only intelligent decision of his life, and went. One by one, and then in a rush, the most dangerous gathering ever assembled at the foot of my steps turned into a crowd of people trying very hard to leave a place without appearing to flee it, which is its own particular kind of running. Han Ming, the sword demon, was the last of the fighters to go. He sheathed a sword he had never drawn. He looked up the long stair, not at the sky now, but at me, the small still monk at the top who had not moved or spoken, or so much as raised his voice through the entire unmaking of his war. And something passed over his face that I had seen only a few times in 1,000 years, the look of a genuine master recognizing all the way down a thing he cannot measure. He inclined his head to me, one professional to whatever I was, and he turned and walked down and away. And that left Li Hanyue, alone, at the bottom of my mountain, at the head of an army that had evaporated around her, staring up at me with her brother's exact furious eyes, having brought the whole strength of the wider world to my door, only to watch heaven fold it up and hand it back to her empty. She did not run. I will give her that. Her revenge was ash in her mouth, and her allies were specks on the switchbacks below, and she stood there anyway, shaking, and she asked me the only question left, the one the whole world was about to ask at once. Then who, she said, who are you? Who is above them? Who is above all 8 of them? I did not have to answer her. The sky was already doing it. Because there were 2 names left, and the second one flew in from very far away, on a phoenix, and the last one had been sweeping the steps this whole time. The second name was a stranger, and for one breath the whole wide world exhaled, because at last, here was someone who did not belong to my mountain, Yi Feng. And where the other 11 names had simply appeared in the sky, this one arrived in person, because the man had heard the demons of White Cloud Mountain were being ranked and had decided, in the arrogance that I would come to know was the family trait, to fly across half the world and deal with us himself. He came down out of the clouds on an azure phoenix the size of a war barge, robes streaming, a cold, beautiful man at the low threshold of the divine roaming profound realm, which made him, until about 30 seconds from now, the single strongest being the wider world had ever confirmed, the reigning number 1 under heaven, the grand supreme Tao Master's own blade, and though few knew it, the quiet spy master who had spent a lifetime learning everyone's secrets before they learned his. He was descended from an old and terrible line, and long ago, in the sack of the very Luguan school my master had been born into, it had been a boo who put its last guardian in the ground. He and my temple had older business than he knew. He came flying in to slay the demons of White Cloud, the presumptive strongest man alive, and heaven ranked him second, and he found that out in the air, in front of everyone, mid-flight, the way you find out the floor is gone, because the first name was writing itself now, slow and final, and heaven does a thing for the first name that it does for no other. It does not merely write it. It opens it, over every province and every ocean, in letters of light a mile high, and then in something more than letters, the sky began to show the world the life of the being it had ranked above all others. Not to you. You were there for all of it. For them, the emperors and the sword-immortals and the holy lands and the last shaking woman at the foot of my steps, the sky rolled back 1,000 years in the space of a dozen breaths, and the whole world watched it happen at once and made no sound at all. They watched a corporate slave die face down on a desk in a world none of them would ever have names for, and wake up screaming in a cradle in this one. They watched a small orphan take the seal of a dying temple from a dying master. They watched 7 swords rise over a mountain and a prime minister decide, wrongly, that he was safe. They watched a king of Qin climb a mountain on foot because a monk had told him to, and hand that monk a throne, and watched the monk crush the jade of his own royal blood to powder in his fist and ask for nothing but to be left alone. They watched a field go quiet at a place called Changping. They watched a condemned general saved on the road by a borrowed sword, and a boy king saved in his own palace by a blade thrown from 100 miles away. They watched a mountain that never once started a war and never once lost one. And they watched, last, a man stand inside the tribulation lightning and break the final gate and become the thing the world had not seen, walking its earth in living memory, a living true immortal, and then watched him turn his back on the open door of heaven itself and walk down off the thunderhead to go and reassure a frightened cat. And then the letters finished, and the name stood alone at the top of heaven's own list, above the Phoenix Rider, above the 8 of my children, above the living Buddha and the Thunder Immortal, above every emperor and every holy land and every legend the wider world had ever frightened itself with, and the name was Xuan Jingyi, abbot of White Cloud Temple, the only living true immortal in all 9 provinces, and it did not so much as have a title in front of it, because heaven had evidently decided none was large enough, and a broom would do. The whole world moved at once. Far away in the north, the Tang Emperor Tang Yong, who had chosen this exact season of Great Qin's weakness to send 300,000 men pouring across its border under his best general, read the name at the top of the sky and went the color of a corpse. He knew the stories the way generals know the weather they might have to fight in. A blade that killed a man from 100 miles off, out of a clear sky, with no warning and no defense. And that blade belonged to a living true immortal who was, it now turned out, fond of the very empire he had just invaded. There is no dignified way for an emperor to recall 300,000 men in a single day, but Tang Yong found the fastest, undignified way there was, because a man who has just learned that the strongest being in creation might personally object to his war does not spend another night pretending he started it on purpose. The Holy Land scrambled. Whole libraries of spies were set turning at once because 6 ancient powers had just been told, all together, that the single mightiest being alive had been sitting in a province they'd have struggled to find on a map, under a leaking roof, for longer than most of their patriarchs had been breathing, and not one of them had known. Fear is one thing. Fear of a rival you can see is survivable, but fear of how blind you have just been proven to be, that is the fear that keeps holy lands awake, and it rippled outward across the wider world from every direction at once. And in the newly quiet fields of Great Qin itself, the ordinary people, the farmers and the soldiers' widows and the children born into the first peace in 500 years, looked up at the sky and slowly understood a thing their grandparents had whispered as a fairy tale, that there had been all along a monk on a mountain, that when their boy king was small and alone and hunted, a sword of blue light had come out of nowhere to save him, twice, and no one had ever known whose hand sent it. That the peace they were standing in, the ended war, the single sky, had a name behind it they had never been told, and heaven had just written that name a mile high for all of them to finally read. Some of them wept, most of them just looked up for a long time, the way you do when a story you were told as a child turns out, impossibly, to have been true the whole time. And in a traveling palace far to the east, in a place that the histories would soon learn to call Xianxia, a dying man read the name at the top of heaven and wept, because he alone of all the world had always known it. I felt it happen, the way I felt most things by then. My grandnephew, the boy king I had saved twice from the dark and taught, in dreams he thought were sent by some nameless 9 heavens immortal, to be more than the frightened child he started as. The first emperor of a united world, the one who had ended the warring ages, was dying by inches in that eastern palace, poisoned slow and careful by people who wanted his empire to burn behind him, and he was staring up at my name in the sky and understanding, at the very end, exactly whose hand had been on his shoulder his whole life. And he did the thing a desperate man does. He reached for it. Somewhere in that palace a shadow slipped out and turned west, toward my mountain, carrying an emperor's last and most secret plea to the one being in creation who might be able to answer it. But that shadow had a long way to run, and it was not the only thing racing toward the truth of who I was, and all of that, I am afraid, belongs to the next story, and not this one. I have had 1,000 years of people underestimating me, and I got bored of the feeling somewhere around year 400, so I will not pretend the moment landed on me the way it landed on them, but I watched it land on them, and that I will remember. I watched Ye Feng, second in all the world, and just now, informed of it in front of everyone, pull his phoenix up short in the air, hovering, staring at a name above his own, at a life he had just watched, and for the first time, that cold, beautiful face showed something other than certainty, because a spymaster's whole art is knowing the shape of the board, and he had just discovered the board was somebody else's, and always had been. I knew that look too, though I would not understand for a while how much trouble it was. It was not fear. It was a man who had been first his entire life, recalculating what he would have to do, and to whom, to be first again. Some men meet something greater than themselves and are made humble by it. A rare few are made hungry. I had just, without lifting a finger, acquired an enemy who would spend the next age of the world trying to find a knife long enough to reach me. But that, like so much else, is the next story. I watched my neighbors too, and that was pure comedy. On Taiyi Mountain, not so very far away, the Jade River Master, 180 years old and a respectable 7th-rank land immortal, had spent years being politely, relentlessly curious about the strange quiet temple next door, sending his best young prodigy over now and then to probe us, to congratulate us on this or investigate that, the way you keep an eye on an odd neighbor whose garden grows things that should not grow. He had seen the heavenly gate open with his own eyes and had, like everyone sensible, mostly talked himself out of what it meant. Now he stood on his own peak and watched the name of the odd neighbor stand alone at the top of heaven, above him, above his whole holy land, above everyone, and I would later hear that the old man was quiet for a long moment, Then he turned to his disciples and announced, with the swift decisiveness of a man who has survived 180 years by knowing exactly when to stop being proud, that Taiyi Mountain was henceforth the warmest, most devoted, most helpful friend White Cloud Temple had ever had, effective immediately, and that anyone who so much as picked a flower on our side of the ridge would answer to him personally. It is a wonderful thing to watch a man that old get that wise that fast, and I watched Li Hanyue, alone at the bottom of my steps, the last of her army gone, her brother's revenge turned to nothing in her hands. She stood and watched 1,000 years of my life scroll across the sky, and she understood, finally, all at once, the size of the thing she had come to destroy. She had raised an army against a fraud. She had brought 24 of the mightiest people in the world up a mountain to sack a nobody, and the nobody had never come down, had never raised his voice, had never so much as stood up. The strongest being in all of creation had watched her assemble the entire strength of the wider world at his door, and had felt so little threatened by it that he had let heaven handle the introductions. Every soul who had ever climbed my steps to teach the humble abbot a lesson, from Gao Yuan with his killing palm to a phoenix rider who'd flown across the world, all of it, 1,000 years of it, had been the same rehearsal for the same performance, and here at last was the whole world in the seats, getting the answer at once. And the answer was a man with a broom who had been standing at the top of the ladder the entire time, quietly, patiently, waiting for precisely nobody to notice. I stood on my mountain and looked up at my own name burning across all of heaven, and I did not feel triumphant particularly. What I felt mostly was tired and a little exposed, and underneath that, the strange loose quiet that comes at the end of a very long walk, when you finally set the load down and your shoulders do not know what to do with themselves. 1,000 years is a long time to carry a secret. The sky had just taken it from me, all at once, in front of everyone, and my arms did not know how to hang now that they had nothing left to hide. And then, the way it always does, the enormous moment ended and the ordinary one after it began. And the ordinary one is the part I actually want to tell you about, because it is the part that is mine. The list faded from the sky, eventually, the way even heaven's announcements do, and what it left behind was a perfectly ordinary morning on a mountain with a great many things that now needed dealing with. There was, first, the matter of the woman at the bottom of my steps. Li Hanyue had not moved. Her army was gone, scattered down the switchbacks like dropped rice, and she stood alone at the foot of my stairs with her brother's sword in her hand and her brother's revenge turned to ash in her chest, and she looked up the long climb at me, and I looked down at her, and we held that for a while. I could have ended her without standing up. She knew it. Everyone who had just watched the sky knew it, and here is the thing I want you to understand about being the strongest being alive, the thing that took me 10 lifetimes to learn and that no reward in my system ever taught me. The whole point of the power, the entire point, is what you do not do with it. I had incinerated her brother because he came to kill my disciple and left me no room. She had come to kill me, and heaven had already unmade her army, and she was a shaking woman at the bottom of a hill with nothing left, and there was no honor and no safety and no anything to be gained by reaching down and snuffing her out, so I didn't. I told her gently that her brother had died reaching for other people's things, and that she did not have to, and that the road down the mountain was open, and that if she ever came back up it with a sword, I would be genuinely sorry about how the day went. And I let her stand there and decide, and I turned my attention to the rest of my morning, which is its own kind of mercy and its own kind of insult, and both were deserved. What she did with it is, as I keep saying, the next story. There was, second, a new disciple standing very quietly 3 steps up from the bottom, Ling Tao, Zheng Wuji's own cloth sword boy, who had bowed to me in front of his fleeing master and asked to sweep my steps rather than be first anywhere else. He was still there. He had not moved during the whole unmaking of the war party, just stood with his head down and waited to see whether the mountain that heaven had crowned 8 times would have a boy whose only credential was that he'd had the sense to change sides at the right moment. I came down the steps to him myself. I have collected disciples out of ditches and off of bridges and out of blocks of jade. And I have made proud men catch fish for a month to earn the privilege, and this one had earned it simply by looking at the truth and choosing it faster than his own master, which is rarer than talent. I told him he was welcome, and that we ate together at sundown, and that his first job was to help the monkey stop stealing the offering fruit. And I watched a boy who had just walked away from everything he knew discover he had walked toward a home. He cried a little. I pretended kindly not to see it. There was, third and loudest, a cat. Luna had come out onto the terrace to supervise the aftermath, as was her right as self-appointed king of the mountain, and she was, I regret to report, insufferable. She had just been ranked the 9th mightiest being in all of creation, above living Buddhas, above thunder immortals, above emperors, and she knew it, and she wanted everyone to know that she knew it. She walked the length of the terrace with her tail up like a war banner. She sat on the highest stone and surveyed the mountain that was, more than ever, indisputably hers. When Yu Susu, still learning the whole business of being a person, asked her what ninth strongest alive actually meant, Luna explained at length with the patience of a monarch instructing a foreign guest that it meant everyone below the eighth strongest, which was almost everyone, had to be nice to her now, and that this had frankly always been the case, and heaven had merely gotten around to putting it in writing. I had spent 300 years being ruled by that cat. Being informed by heaven that she outranked the Holy Lands changed absolutely nothing about our arrangement and improved her opinion of herself by a margin I would not have believed possible. And there was, last, an old man beside me who had gone very quiet. Jianghu had come out to watch the sky with the rest of us, and he had said nothing the entire time, through the snake and the cat and the boy with no talent and the drowned emperor and the beggar king and all of it. And when the first name finally stood alone at the top, he had made a low sound in his chest that I had heard from him exactly twice in 1,000 years. I looked over. My 10th senior brother, 98 years old, the living god of death with his wars finally behind him, was looking at my name burning at the top of heaven. And then he looked down the mountain toward the empire in the distance where the fourth name commanded armies, the beggar boy he had trained into the undefeated king, and his old hard face did something it almost never did, which was soften all the way to the bone. All those years, he said, roughly, all those years I thought I was the one carrying great chin. He shook his head, and it was you. It was always you, sitting up here sweeping, holding all of us up where nobody could see the hand. He was quiet a moment. Then, being Jianghu, he ruined it. Number one, he grunted, and you still cheat at Go. I told him I had never once needed to cheat to beat him, which was true, and which started an argument we had been having for 1,000 years, and that, more than the sky, more than the list, more than the whole watching world, was the sound of coming home. And scattered across that watching world, the rest of my family looked up at the same sky, and each of them, wherever they were, knew. I could feel them, the way you feel a house full of sleepers, even in the dark. In a war camp on a distant frontier, the undefeated king stepped out of his command tent and read his own name at the 4th place and his master's at the 1st. The man who had once been a starving boy who flinched at a raised hand stood alone in the cold and let his shoulders shake once, because the hand that had fed him first was written across all of heaven now, and everyone would finally know what he had always known. In a tea house in the capital that was secretly the beating heart of an empire's whole web of eyes and whispers, my first disciple, the bearded fool turned third mightiest being alive, read the list and laughed his enormous laugh and poured wine for strangers who had no idea they were drinking with a legend, and started, quietly, making arrangements to come home. On some dusty road, a white-haired woman who had once been all grief looked up at her name in 6th place, and for once, thought not of the mother she'd avenged, but of the man who taught her there was life on the far side of it, and turned her feet toward the mountain. And far in the frozen west, an ice emperor and his empress stood on a wall of their own snow kingdom, and read a name they had both believed was mourning them, and the unbending man who could not send a single letter finally understood he would have to, because the whole world could see now exactly where his teacher was, and it was long, long past time to go and be embarrassed in person. They were coming home, all of them. The sky had not only told the world who I was, it had told my scattered children where the door was, and lit the way, and one by one, across a whole continent, they had turned toward it. That was the morning after I became the loudest name in heaven, a woman deciding whether to leave, a boy learning he'd found a family, a cat being unbearable, an old friend, finally at peace, calling me a cheat. The wider world was reeling out there, sending riders and readying fleets and rewriting everything it thought it knew. And up on my mountain, we ate together at sundown, the way we always did. I want to give you that table, because it is the truest thing I own. Picture it. The wider world, if it could have seen this table, would have lost its collective mind, because heaven had just ranked half the people sitting at it among the 12 mightiest beings in all of creation, and here they were passing rice. Xuantian, 5th in the world, arguing with a snake about whether snakes needed to eat cooked food now that they had opinions. Yu Susu, 10th in the world, sulking because the answer was yes, and she missed swallowing things whole. Luna holding court from the honored seat she had simply taken, 9th in creation, and utterly convinced the ranking had been the least of her achievements that day. Old Jianghu, who had unified a continent, losing an argument about Go to me for the 10,000th time. Mei Lia and Xiao Xiaoran, who had buried a master with me 1,000 years ago when we were 4 frightened children, sitting at the ends of the table like the pillars they were. The new boy, Ling Tao, too overwhelmed to eat much, being pressed to eat more by everyone, the way a family adopts a stranger by force of feeding. And down among our feet the animals, the monkey with his whittled sword laid carefully beside him like the other's blades, the embarrassed phoenix, the whole enlightened menagerie of a mountain that turned strays into legends and then made them do the dishes. 8 new names in Heaven's 12, and at that table not one of them was a legend. They were my students and my siblings and my strays, and they bickered about rice and they teased the new boy and they let the old cat pretend she ran the place, which she did, and it was exactly, in every particular, an evening like 10,000 evenings before it. The sky had changed what the world knew about my mountain. It had changed nothing at all about my mountain. That, if you want it, is the whole secret I spent 1,000 years learning. Power is what the world argues about. This was what it was for. So let me leave you where I actually am, now that the sky has gone and told everybody. 1,000 years ago, I was a man who died face down on a keyboard because a company wanted 1 more quarter out of him, and nobody at the funeral could have told you a single true thing about who he was. Today, I am the only living true immortal in the world, my name written across heaven for every living soul to read, my mountain crowned 8 times over, and I turned down the open gate of paradise itself to keep sweeping the steps of a leaking temple full of people I love. Between those 2 men are 10 lifetimes, 168 birthday gifts, 1 avenged teacher, 1 crushed jade throne, 1 buried empire's worth of the dead at Changping, a snake who became a dragon, a beggar who became a king, and exactly one thing I never managed to do. I never found her. The scroll is still in my sleeve. Somewhere out in that wide, staring, newly warned world is the thread that leads back to a promise I made in my second life and have carried, unbroken, through 8 lives since. Find me again, she said, across the lives and the deaths, however far the wheel turns. And now the wheel has turned all the way to the top of heaven's own list, and my name is the loudest thing in the sky, and if she is out there, anywhere, in any life, under any other name, she can finally see exactly where I am. Of course, so can everything else. The wide world is coming to my mountain now, and it is not all coming to Neil. There are holy lands that do not enjoy being ranked below a cat. There is a phoenix rider flying home second in all the world for the first time in his life, deciding he does not care for the feeling. There is a woman at the bottom of my steps this very moment with her whole revenge turned to ash and nowhere left to put it. There is an empire out there with an emperor dying in it, poisoned slowly in a place that will be called Jianghu, sending his last shadow up my mountain to beg the strongest man alive to keep him breathing. And far, far above all of it, higher than the 9th realm, higher than divine roaming, up on some floor of the sky I glimpsed once and was not impressed by, there is something that never wanted the mortal world made whole, and it has just watched the one man in 1,000 years refuse its open door. It is going to have opinions about me. I look forward to disappointing it. And underneath even that, oldest of all, there is a secret about my very first life, the one before the wheel started turning, the one even I have never been allowed to remember, and I have the growing sense that the whole staring world and I are going to learn it together. But that is the next story. Come back for it. For now, I have waited 1,000 years for the woman in that scroll, and I can wait a little longer for the rest of the world to arrive. They will find me exactly where they always could have if they had only thought to look up, at the top of a small mountain, under a leaking roof, broom in hand, immortal and unhurried, with all the time in creation, and, for the first time in 1,000 years, a direction to point it in.